I've spent my whole life believing that the forest speaks only when you've earned the right to hear it. Not with words, not with anything you could record or replay for someone else, but with the kind of quiet that presses against your ribs and asks who you really are when no one's watching. Some people go into the woods to find peace. I went into them because I thought I already knew my place. But the older I get, the more I realize the pines knew me long before I ever learned their names. And they've been speaking to me in ways I didn't dare admit, not even to myself. My name is Cole. I'm 48 years old, and for more than 2 decades, I've worked as a forest ranger in the northern stretch of the Bitterroot Mountains. Up here, the air tastes like cold iron in the mornings, and the ridgelines hold fog the way a hand holds a secret. The locals who've stayed long enough all say the same thing. The mountains don't mind you being here, so long as you don't pretend you're the one in charge. I used to smile at that. I used to think it was just small-town poetry or the kind of superstition you inherit from parents who never traveled far from their own front porch. I didn't realize it was a warning. The outpost where I work sits on an old logging road that barely looks like a road anymore. Most days I oversee trail safety, run check-ins with hikers, or handle radio reports from campgrounds scattered across the tree line. I know these woods. Every bend, every slope, every place where the wind gathers and pushes downhill in a low, throaty hum. I can identify animals by the weight of their steps or the shape of their breathing. I can tell when something is moving toward me or away from me by the way the branches lean. But there's a difference between knowing the forest and understanding it. And I think the understanding only came after I stopped being honest with myself. People assume that rangers don't scare easily. They think years of being surrounded by wolves and bears and endless miles of darkness makes us immune to fear. But fear isn't something you lose. It's something you learn to negotiate with. It shows up in places you don't expect. It shows up when the forest is too still, when the nights are too warm for the season, when you hear something you can't name echoing down a ravine. And sometimes fear shows up in the stories locals whisper at diners and gas stations, stories about shapes crossing the ridge at dusk, or something tall watching campsites from just beyond the lantern light. The first time I heard the word Yeti in this region, I laughed. Not disrespectfully, just with a kind of exhausted amusement. Every forest in America has its own version of the same legend, too big, too silent, too smart to be an ordinary animal. I filed it away as folklore, a coping mechanism for what can't be explained. Nothing more. But over the years, the stories stopped being vague. Different people, hunters, hikers, night shift workers, came to me with descriptions that overlapped too cleanly to ignore. Something standing upright. Something walking with weight, but not sound. Something with the outline of a man and the breadth of a bear. Something always keeping distance, as if waiting for the moment when distance wouldn't matter anymore. Still, I didn't let myself believe it. I've always been good at shutting down instincts that make me uncomfortable. That might sound strange coming from a ranger, but it's the truth. I grew up in these woods, and my father taught me that fear is a distraction, a weak man's excuse to avoid responsibility. So I buried fear so deep that eventually I couldn't tell instinct from imagination. I told myself the strange footprints I found belonged to elk, even when they were too long and too narrow. I told myself the echoing calls in winter were nothing but shifting ice, even when they rose and fell like language. I told myself the tree bark stripped in sweeping arcs had been torn by claws, even when no animal leaves marks at shoulder height on a Douglas fir. But even denial has its limits. It was a cold autumn night 2 years ago when something in me shifted, the kind of night where the sky feels closer, where the stars look like they're leaning in to listen. I had been called out to check on an overdue hiker, a teenager from Spokane who had gone off-trail chasing photographs of elk. It wasn't the first time someone wandered off-trail, and usually I'd find them sitting on a log with embarrassment replacing panic. But this one was different. The boy's father had reported hearing his son scream over the phone before the call dropped, not the scream of someone who tripped or panicked, a scream that cut off mid-breath. When I reached the search area, the forest felt wrong. I don't mean dangerous. Danger is familiar. I mean wrong, like the woods were pretending to be themselves, like the air was wearing a mask and hadn't realized I was close enough to see the seams. The moment I stepped between the first two lodge poles, the temperature dropped hard. Not gradually, not in the way a breeze cools the air. It dropped as though something had taken all the warmth and pressed it underground. My boot tracks were the only sound for miles. Even the birds had gone silent. No wing beats, no distant owls. Total stillness. I swept my flashlight through the trees and the beam dissolved into fog, catching only faint silhouettes of branches stretching up like they were reaching for something they couldn't quite grasp. When I found the boy's footprints, my stomach tightened. They were erratic, spaced too far apart for someone walking. It looked like he'd been running, fast. The footprints veered sharply to the right, toward a narrow drainage gulch. I followed them until they vanished at a patch of disturbed earth. At first, I thought I was seeing things. The ground didn't look trampled. It looked scooped, like something large had cupped its hand into the soil and lifted a piece away. I crouched down and touched the indentation. It was dry, but the air above it was warm in a way that made no physical sense. It reminded me of standing too close to the mouth of a cave. Then I heard it. A single exhale, deep, heavy, slow. It came from the darkness between two old pines ahead of me. Not a growl, not a snarl, a breath. And it was big, bigger than any animal I've ever documented in these woods. I should have called for backup. Every part of my training told me to. But something old, something stubborn and forged long before I ever wore this uniform, told me not to move. That if I so much as lifted my hand toward my radio, whatever was standing 30 feet ahead would take it as a challenge. The breath came again, slower this time, closer. I raised my flashlight, and the beam caught the outline of something stepping sideways behind the trunk. Not a full figure, not even a face, just weight shifting with intelligence, deliberate. For the first time in years, instinct broke through the wall I had built around it. Every hair on my arms rose. My throat tightened. I felt something ancient inside me. Something I had buried since childhood. Press up from the dark like a memory begging not to be forgotten. I felt fear, pure and undiluted, telling me that this was not normal, that the woods were holding their breath because they knew something I refused to accept. I took one step back, then another. My boots sank softly into the forest floor. The breathing paused as if surprised. I whispered into the radio, barely audible, requesting immediate assistance. I didn't take my eyes off the tree, and then from just behind it, something reached across the bark. A hand. Long, pale, knuckles hard as stone, fingers that wrapped halfway around the trunk before retreating into darkness. My breath broke, my denial with it. The forest, for the first time in my life, felt like it was watching me make the wrong decision. I didn't run. Not yet. Running in the forest at night is a good way to break an ankle or find yourself face first in a ravine. But every nerve in my body screamed to get away from that tree, away from whatever intelligence had just measured me. My breath fogged in front of me, uneven and trembling, and the quiet around me thickened until it felt like the woods were pushing against my chest. I moved backwards slowly, keeping the trunk in my flashlight beam, watching for another movement, another hand, another shift in the darkness. But the forest stayed still, like whatever stood behind that pine was holding everything, wind, sound, air, even time, in place until it decided what happened next. My radio crackled. A voice whispered through the static, but I couldn't make out the words. I lifted it to my mouth, whispered, "Say that again." But the radio hissed loud enough to echo between the trees, and instantly everything changed. The breath behind the pine sharpened. Not louder, clearer. Like whatever was there had been listening so closely that the smallest sound struck it like a spark. I stepped back again, another careful inch. My hand tightened around the flashlight until my knuckles ached. I scanned the spaces between the trees, looking for an escape path, somewhere I could move without drawing attention. But the fog had thickened, settling low across the ground like a slow-moving tide, and every trail looked unfamiliar. Then the hand appeared again. This time, it wasn't gripping the tree. It was pressed flat against it, as if feeling the vibrations of the forest. The fingers were too long, too jointed, too deliberate. They slid slowly across the bark, mapping the surface like reading Braille, and then they stopped, pointing straight at me. My legs almost gave out. The hand didn't lower or curl or wave. It held still, with a tension I could feel even from 30 feet away. It was choosing or warning or marking me the way a hawk marks a rabbit. I finally turned, forcing myself to walk instead of sprint. Each step weighted with the knowledge that something was behind me, something that moved with intelligence and silence and patience. I didn't hear it follow. That was somehow worse. The forest stayed empty of sound, as if listening for the moment I slipped. Only when I reached the ridge did the world return. A single nightbird called out, shrill and abrupt, then another deeper in the trees. Wind moved through the branches again, shaking off the unnatural stillness. The forest exhaled, and only then did I realize I had been holding my own breath for too long. I reported the location. Search and rescue teams arrived an hour later, moving down the trail in coordinated lines with dogs and high-powered headlamps. But the fog had lifted by then, and every sign of the boys' path had been wiped clean. No footprints, no disturbed soil, nothing but pine needles and cold earth. We searched for 3 days. We never found the boy. The official report listed him as missing, presumed lost to terrain misadventure. But the father's voice still rings in my ears. He screamed. He screamed like something grabbed him. That wasn't slipping. That wasn't a fall. I knew he was right. I knew what I had seen. But I buried it because that's what I've always done. Denial is a skill, and I've honed it so finely over the years that it became second nature. I told myself the hand was a trick of light. I told myself the breathing was an echo bouncing off stone. I told myself fear fills empty spaces with shapes that don't belong. But I didn't sleep for days, and when I finally did, I dreamed of fingers curling around pine bark. That was just the beginning. The next story came in winter. Snow had fallen early that year, thick and wet, the kind that swallows sound and turns the forest into a maze of white corridors. I'd been sent to check on a remote cabin used by researchers from the local university. They were seasonal regulars, always polite, always prepared, always a little too enthusiastic for their own safety. Their radio had gone quiet 2 days earlier. No emergency call, no distress signal, just silence. I hitched the snowmobile and rode the 14 miles up the frozen valley toward the cabin. The wind was relentless, and the pine boughs were heavy with snow, leaning low enough to brush my shoulders as I passed. Every engine vibration rattled up my arms, and the cold seeped through every layer of clothing until my bones felt brittle. I smelled the cabin before I saw it. Not smoke, not food. Something metallic, faint but immediate, like the scent of pennies rubbed between fingers. Blood, but mixed with something colder, the smell of rock exposed deep underground. I killed the engine and listened. Silence. Not the usual winter quiet, a silence that felt packed, compressed, unnatural in its heaviness, the kind that makes you hesitate before taking another step. The cabin door was closed. No footprints around it. No tracks leading away. The snow was untouched, too perfect for a place that should have shown signs of life. I approached slowly, hand on my sidearm, not because I truly believed it would help, but because instinct told me to. And instinct was something I had begun, reluctantly, to listen to again. When I pushed the door open, the hinges barely whispered. The interior was dim, lit only by a faint gray light seeping through frost-covered windows. There were sleeping bags on the floor, half-zipped, their owners missing, coffee mugs sitting half full and frozen, a lantern on its side, a notebook with a pen still resting on top, mid-sentence. But what stopped me wasn't the stillness or the absence of people. It was the footprints, not outside, inside the cabin. Dozens of them. Bare, large, wrong. They covered the wooden floor in chaotic loops as if something had paced and turned and circled and paused. The snow near the door had melted in patches, leaving puddles that had refrozen into thin sheets of ice. And in the center of the room, one footprint was pressed harder than the rest, deeper, like whoever, whatever, left it had put its full weight down in one spot, contemplating something. I followed the prints with my eyes, tracking their motion, their patterns, the way they avoided the windows, avoided the broken lantern, avoided the open notebook, but clustered around the fireplace where the stones were still warm to the touch. Something had been here recently. And then the scent changed. A draft swept through the cabin, chilling my face. But it wasn't the cold I noticed. It was the smell that rode on that draft, pine sap and something sour beneath it. Breath. Warm breath. Something was behind me. I didn't look right away. I kept my eyes on the far wall, my hand tightening around my flashlight the way a drowning man clings to a rope. I could hear it, a slow inhale, pulling the air through the room as if tasting it. Then a long, heavy exhale, warm enough that the hair on the back of my neck rose. I turned the flashlight. The beam caught the edge of the doorway first, then the corner of the cabin, then the open space behind me. Nothing. The breath had stopped. But the window across the room was fogged from the inside. Someone had stood there seconds before. I moved toward the fogged window slowly, every step deliberate, as if the wooden planks beneath me might shatter from the weight of my own heartbeat. The fog on the glass formed a pattern, not chaotic, not smeared by a hand brushing past, but purposeful. 3 long streaks dragging downward, evenly spaced, ending at the same point, like something with long fingers had pressed its hand flat against the window, then pulled down. I raised my palm and held it next to the markings. My hand looked small, fragile, human. Whatever had stood there was none of those things. I backed away, scanning the room again. The footprints, the melted patches of snow, the half-frozen mugs, all of it told a story I didn't want to believe. But the missing researchers, their absence, that was what dug deepest under my skin. They hadn't walked out. They hadn't left in a panic. They had been taken. And the thing that took them had stood at that window long enough to leave frost behind. I swallowed hard and moved toward the doorway. The snow outside was clean, untouched, but that meant nothing. Whatever I was dealing with didn't walk the way people walked. It didn't leave tracks unless it wanted to. The air felt heavy again, thick with the metallic scent, the underground cave smell that didn't belong in open winter air. As I stepped off the cabin porch, the wind shifted, a low, rolling sound that wasn't quite a gust, more like breath moving between branches. The pines swayed slightly under the weight of snow, but one tree, one massive lodgepole, didn't move at all. The others bent. That one stood rigid, straight, refusing to sway even an inch under the wind's push. I knew before I even looked directly at it that something was behind it. I angled my flashlight slowly toward the base of the trunk. The beam shook in my hand, not enough to betray panic, but enough to remind me what fear feels like when you stop pretending you're above it. The light cut across the snow, catching drifts and shadows and brittle ice. Then it caught something else, a shape. Tall, broad, almost blending with the shadow of the tree. The outline was wrong. Too smooth in some places, too distorted in others. I could see the faint suggestion of a shoulder, the curve of a torso, the angle of a head, but no face, no eyes, no features. Just the silhouette of something that shouldn't have been able to stand that still in the cold for that long. My throat tightened. I took one step back, the snow crunching under my boot like a declaration I didn't want to make. The figure didn't move, didn't react, didn't even breathe. The only sound was the soft ticking of melting frost falling from the cabin roof. Then, with a slow and impossible motion, the shadow leaned just slightly into the tree as if listening through it. As if the pine trunk was the barrier between us and it was deciding whether or not to cross it. I didn't wait for the conclusion. Instinct, the instinct I had denied so many times, snapped back into command. I started backing away toward the snowmobile, keeping my light fixed on the silhouette. But the moment I reached the machine, the light flickered, once, twice, and died. Total darkness swallowed me. Not darkness like night. Darkness like the forest had closed its eyes. I froze. I listened. The cold pressed against me like a weight. My breath came out in uneven clouds that I could feel but couldn't see. The silence wrapped around me thick and suffocating. Then I heard footsteps. Not fast, not aggressive. Slow. Measured. Each step sunk deep into the snow, deliberate enough to send tiny vibrations up through the ground. It was coming around the tree. I felt it before I heard it. Felt the shift in the air, the temperature dip, the animal-like pause between each motion. I fumbled for my backup light, clipped to the snowmobile's frame. My fingers shook as I snapped it on. The beam cut through the dark in a sharp line and hit nothing. The tree was still there. The snow was still undisturbed. But the silhouette was gone. My breath stuck in my chest. Either it moved faster than anything its size should be able to, or it never touched the ground at all. I didn't linger. I fired up the snowmobile, the engine roaring to life so loud it startled even me. And as I turned it toward the valley, the wind behind me shifted again. Not a gust, not a howl, but a long, low exhale. Like disappointment. Like it had let me go because it wanted to. The ride back down the ridge was a blur. Snow stung my face. Branches whipped past. Every shadow felt like a figure emerging. Every hollow looked like a mouth in the landscape waiting to swallow me whole. Even the engine felt too quiet, swallowed by the winter that pressed in from every direction. By the time I reached the outpost, my hands were trembling so violently I had to sit on them just to fill out the incident report. But I didn't write everything. I wrote the facts. Missing researchers, disturbed cabin, evidence of intrusion, nothing more. Not because I feared being dismissed, but because I feared being believed. If I wrote what I had really seen, if I described the handprint on the window or the way the silhouette leaned against the lodgepole like it was listening to its own heartbeat through the wood, someone would take it seriously. Someone would go up there alone. Someone would think they could handle it. And I couldn't let that happen. The weeks that followed were quiet in the wrong ways. No new calls, no reports of strange sounds, no encounters from hikers or hunters or snowmobilers, nothing but silence, the kind that follows you like a shadow. I slept lightly, waking at the smallest floorboard creak. I kept my radio on even when I knew no one was broadcasting. I found myself staring at the tree line outside my window long after midnight, waiting for movement I prayed I wouldn't see. But the forest doesn't stay quiet forever, and when it wants your attention, it will take it. The third story came in spring. Snow had melted, leaving the ground soft and the rivers hungry. Runoff carved new channels through the underbrush, revealing old debris from storms long past. Trails reopened, and with them came the usual wave of campers, families, and hikers who wanted to shake off winter the moment the sun returned. I was patrolling near Pine Hollow, a place locals avoid without ever saying why. They offer excuses. Too many mosquitoes, too muddy, too dense with brush. But I've learned people lie most when protecting themselves from memories they don't have the courage to revisit. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I saw him. An older man standing at the tree line. He wasn't moving, not walking, not turning, just standing, one hand pressed against the trunk of a massive pine. His posture was rigid, unnatural, like something held him in place. I approached slowly, afraid to break whatever spell he was under. "Sir? Are you all right?" He didn't answer. I stepped closer, the forest tightening around me. "Sir, can you hear me?" Still nothing. Then he spoke without moving his hand from the tree. "It's listening," he whispered. My skin crawled. What's listening? He finally turned his head, and his eyes weren't focused on me. They were glassy, wide, terrified of something behind me. "Not what," he said. "Who?" I spun around. The forest was empty, but something in the air shifted, a familiar pressure like breath warming the back of my neck, and the older man whispered, "You shouldn't have come here alone." For a moment, I didn't move. Not because I thought stillness would keep me safe, but because something primal inside me, something older than reason, older than the job, older than every badge I'd ever pinned to my uniform, told me that sudden motion would be a mistake I wouldn't get the chance to take back. The older man's breathing was shallow, his fingers trembling where they pressed against the bark. The tree seemed to anchor him, like if he let go, he'd fall into something none of us could see. I scanned the woods again. The pines stood tall and quiet, but there was a heaviness to them, a tilt in their stance as if they were leaning closer, curious about the two of us trespassing in their silence. A breeze swept through the hollow, carrying the smell of damp earth and pine pitch, but beneath it, faint and sour and unmistakable, was the scent I'd come to dread, the underground smell, the cave smell, the smell of something that had waited a long, long time. The man's voice barely rose above a whisper. "Tell me you didn't hear it." My throat tightened. Hear what? He swallowed hard, eyes flicking to the shadows between the trees. The knocking. My stomach dropped. Knocking. I already knew I didn't want the answer, but dread pushed me forward. Where? He closed his eyes briefly, as though gathering whatever courage he had left. Every night for a month. 3 knocks. Always 3. At my window. At my door. Sometimes at the side of my house, like it was running its hand across the boards, deciding where to press next. I tried to ignore it. My boy told me it was branches in the wind. But last night, he stopped. His voice cracked. Last night, I heard it say my name. A chill climbed up my spine, settling behind my ribs like a stone. I knew that pattern. Sound as warning. Sound as territory. Sound as intent. But hearing your name, that meant something different, something intimate. His hand slid down the bark, fingers curling as though he meant to pull away. But he didn't. He couldn't. His knuckles whitened. "It doesn't want the house anymore," he whispered. "It wants me." I stepped closer, ready to lead him out of the clearing stuff, but the man shook his head so sharply it startled me. "Don't touch me," he hissed. "Not here." "Why?" "Because it'll know you're helping." The forest exhaled, a deep groan through the pines, and the branches above us shuddered. Shadows lengthened across the ground, stretching toward the man's feet like long, dark fingers. He was right. Something was watching. I tried again, more firmly. "Sir, we need to leave this area. You're not safe here." He pressed his forehead against the tree trunk now, breath fogging the bark. "You think I don't know that? You think I didn't try?" It followed me. All the way down from the ridge, all the way through the night. It doesn't care about the boundary lines on your maps. This forest doesn't belong to you. His voice broke, the words spilling like confession. It never has. The wind fell silent again, cut off mid-sway like the woods had paused to listen. Even the insects seemed to vanish. The entire hollow grew still, expectant. I glanced behind us. Nothing. But the nothing felt crowded. The air thickened, heavy enough to taste. It pressed against my ears, muffling distant sound. The man's breath quickened, shallow and sharp, the kind of panic I'd seen in injured animals cornered by predators. I placed a hand near his shoulder, not touching, just close, to show him he wasn't alone. "What do you want me to do?" His face twisted as though he were fighting something inside himself. Finally, he lifted his hand from the tree. It shook violently, as if the effort cost him something visible. "Take me back," he whispered. "Take me somewhere with light, somewhere it won't follow." I nodded, slowly, deliberately. We turned toward the trail, but the forest turned with us. Branches creaked. Snow, though it had long since melted, seemed to hiss across the soil. The shadows between the pines deepened, darkening faster than clouds could move, faster than the sun could dip. The hollow shifted in a way I felt before I fully understood. Paths didn't look like paths anymore. Brush seemed denser, the tree line closer. The forest was rearranging itself. Not dramatically, not overtly, but subtly, purposefully. A predator closing distance. I kept the older man close, guiding him back step by step. He leaned heavily, every exhale ragged, his boots dragging like he'd aged 20 years in minutes. I scanned everything. Every trunk, every hollow, every stand of brush for movement, for breath. Then it came, from deep in the trees to our left. 3 knocks, slow, heavy, deliberate. My heart seized. The man whimpered. The knocks came again, closer, not wood to wood, more like weight hitting bark. Something striking a tree with the back of its hand, something using sound the way wolves use distance calls, mapping, warning, controlling. I raised my flashlight even though it felt useless in daylight. The beam quivered over the pines. Then I saw it, a silhouette between the trunks, tall, unmoving, too still to be human. Its arm was raised just slightly, elbow bent like it was preparing for another knock. Its head tilted in an angle no person could hold naturally. A vibration trembled through the ground, subtle but present, the kind of tremor you'd feel if something massive shifted its weight. The older man clutched my sleeve, his voice cracking. "Don't look at it. Don't give it that." But my eyes were already locked. The silhouette lowered its arm, and then, with a slowness that made my blood turn to ice, the head turned toward us. Not the whole body, just the head. The neck bent further and further, joints straining past human limits, until the face-like shape angled directly at me. I didn't see features, I didn't see eyes, I saw awareness. And that was worse. The older man tugged me hard. "Please, please, we have to go!" His desperation jolted me out of whatever paralysis had taken hold. I forced myself to turn away from the silhouette, guiding him onto the trail, every muscle screaming at me to move faster without running. The knocks followed. One behind us, another to the right, another farther ahead, like we had stepped into a circle. The man's voice broke into sobs. "It's hunting us. Oh God, it's hunting us." No, I snapped, not because it was true, but because panic would get us killed. "Just keep moving. Don't stop. Don't turn around." We walked, fast but steady. I kept him close, kept scanning for the ridge line, for any break in the trees that would bring us back into safer territory. But the forest wasn't done. As we rounded a bend, the air grew colder. Not natural cold, not the shade of a tree or the drop of an afternoon. This cold came from the ground, rising like breath from an open mouth. I recognized it instantly. The cave cold. The same warmth turned sour air from the cabin, the same underground scent that didn't belong in spring. Something was close, too close. The older man stumbled. I grabbed his arm before he fell, pulling him upright. His face was drained, pale, streaked with tears and sweat. "Please," he begged, voice cracking like broken branches. "Please, don't let it take me." I tightened my grip. "I won't." But something in the forest disagreed. Ahead of us, a pine tree creaked. No wind, no pressure. Yet the trunk bowed as though something immense had pressed its weight against it. Bark split. Sap glistened like blood. A shadow moved behind it. Then another. Not silhouettes this time. Shapes. Tall. Silent. Watching. The older man's breath hitched into a sob. They aren't supposed to come this close in daylight. I didn't know who they were or how many of them, but the forest felt crowded with presence. Each tree seemed thicker. Each shadow heavier. The air around us pulsed. We were being driven somewhere, not chased, escorted, guided. And then, through the trees, I saw it. A dark opening carved into the hillside ahead. A cave mouth. Wide enough to swallow 3 men standing shoulder to shoulder. I knew instantly the forest wanted us to go there. I also knew that if we did, we wouldn't come back. The cave mouth loomed in front of us like an open throat. Wide and uneven, framed by roots that curled down from the soil like fingers bracing the edge. A cold draft seeped out from the darkness. Not air, something denser, carrying the scent of stone and damp earth and something metallic beneath it. The older man's breathing tightened into short, choking bursts the moment he saw it. No, not there, not there. His knees buckled, and he sank into the pine needles, gripping handfuls of soil as though he could anchor himself to the surface of the world. I crouched beside him, one hand on his shoulder, the other scanning the tree line that surrounded us like a tightening noose. "You're not going in there," I whispered. "I won't let that happen." But the forest had its own intentions. From the shadows between the trees came a low, resonant sound, not a growl, not a groan, but a harmonic ripple like air vibrating through a hollow bone. It rolled across the clearing, brushing against my skin like icy breath. More movement stirred in the trees, figures shifting, stepping, their silhouettes merging with the trunks and then separating again. Not fast, not aggressive, just present, watching, containing. This wasn't a chase. This was a herding. The older man clutched my pant leg like a terrified child. Please, please don't let them take me underground. Please, I can't go back down there. His words hit me with a jolt. Back down there. You've been inside before? He shook violently, shaking his head in short, panicked jerks, but his eyes said otherwise. Something in him was remembering what his mouth refused to say. What did you see? His gaze drifted toward the cave. His pupils tightened to pinpricks. When he finally spoke, it came out as a broken whisper. They weren't sleeping. A chill spread through my gut. I didn't want to understand. I didn't want any of this to make sense, but the forest didn't care what I wanted. A sharp crack split the silence. Woods splitting under immense force. Behind us, a pine tree bent unnaturally, its trunk bowing inward like something massive had gripped it. I rose to my feet, pulling the older man up with me. His legs barely obeyed, but adrenaline and fear dragged him upright. We're not going in that cave, I said, low and steady. Stay with me. Stay right next to me. We turned away from the cave and took a single step toward the trail. Something shifted in the trees behind us. Something big. The older man stiffened, breath frozen in his throat. Don't look at it, I said softly. Keep your eyes forward. But he couldn't. His terror had become its own gravity. He turned, and the scream that tore out of him was pure animal horror. I spun around, and I saw it. Half hidden behind a pine, a shape leaned out just enough to be seen. A head too high above the ground, shoulders broad enough to eclipse the trunk, arms that dangled past the knees, fingers ending in long, pale points. Its body was covered in a matted layer of hair or moss, I couldn't tell which, but beneath it the form was unmistakably humanoid. It didn't move toward us. It didn't need to. It just stared. The gaze, even without visible eyes, hit with force like a thought pressed directly into my skull. The forest fell completely silent, as though every living thing knew that sound would be a mistake. The man clutched at his throat, gasping, not choking, reacting to the pressure, the weight of that unseen gaze. I grabbed him before he collapsed. Stay with me. Look at me, not at it. But he couldn't tear himself away. His eyes watered. His jaw trembled. His hands went slack. He stared as if entranced. Then something behind the creature shifted, a second shape, and another, 5 in total. But that wasn't the worst part. They were standing in a semicircle, as if closing a ritual. The older man broke. He tried to run, not toward the trail, toward the open clearing, toward the far trees, anywhere but the cave and the creatures that watched it. I lunged to grab him, but he slipped out of my grasp, stumbling over roots and debris. His boots slapped the earth in frantic, uneven rhythm, and that was enough. The lead creature moved, not fast, not lunging, just one step forward, but that single step cracked the branch beneath its foot, a sound so loud it echoed through the hollow like a warning shot. The man screamed. The creature stepped again. The forest shook. Instinct took over. Not denial, not logic. Pure, unfiltered instinct. I ran, not away, after the man. He was heading toward a slope he didn't know was there. A drop-off hidden by underbrush. If he fell, he'd break something. If he stopped, he'd die. I sprinted harder than I had in decades, my boots crushing undergrowth, my lungs burning with cold air. The man reached the slope just as his footing gave out. He toppled forward. I dove, grabbing the back of his jacket, yanking with everything I had. We both hit the ground hard, sliding down the incline in a spray of dirt and pine needles. The fall was brutal, ripping my shoulder, scraping my arms, but we stopped halfway down the slope. And above us, they had followed. All 5. Their silhouettes stood at the top of the incline, framed by the sky, towering and motionless. No body language, no expression, just silent observation, waiting. The older man buried his face in my sleeve, sobbing. They want me. They want me back. Not you, I said, though my voice shook. Not today. Not ever. I half carried him down the slope, away from the cave, away from the clearing, forcing us through scrub thickets and under low branches until the trees began to thin. With every step, I expected to hear footsteps behind us, branches breaking, the harmonic knocking, the deep, heavy breathing I'd heard in the cabin, but nothing came. The forest stayed silent, oppressively silent, like the danger wasn't behind us anymore, like it was beside us. I scanned the trees as we moved, each trunk a possible hiding place, each shadow a threat. The older man clung to me, his legs barely functioning, his breath hitching in sharp gasps. Trauma had hollowed him from the inside. And then somewhere far behind us in the direction of the cave, a low sound rose, a vibrational hum that wavered up, then down like a call answered by something deeper underground. The older man whimpered. "They're waking." I didn't ask what he meant. We moved faster, the forest finally opening enough that the sun broke through, warm and alive in a way I hadn't felt all day. We pushed toward brighter ground, toward space, toward hope. And that's when I saw the first sign we were back near familiar territory, a trail marker, weathered, crooked, human. Relief hit me so fast I nearly dropped to my knees. The older man sagged against a boulder, exhausted. "We're close," I said. "Just keep walking." But the man stared at the trees with empty eyes. "It doesn't matter," he whispered. "You felt it too. You know it now. The forest isn't what we thought." I didn't answer, because he was right. Denying it no longer made sense. Reason had shattered, and the truth was waiting for me to stop pretending. When we finally reached the outpost and got him medical attention, he refused to enter the building. He refused to be under any roof. He sat outside in the gravel, refusing food, refusing water, repeating the same sentence over and over. "They don't sleep, they only wait." I tried to coax meaning out of him, but his mind was already slipping. The EMTs asked if he'd fallen, if he'd been exposed to something poisonous or hallucinogenic, if he'd suffered a breakdown. He didn't answer any of them. He only looked at me, like he expected me to understand. And I did. Because even though we escaped the clearing, escaped the cave, escaped those impossible silhouettes, something inside me had shifted. Something old had woken up, something I had spent a lifetime denying, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that the forest wasn't done with me. Not yet, not even close. The older man didn't last long, not physically, he healed fine, but mentally, something had cracked in him so deeply that even sunlight couldn't reach whatever broke in the dark. He stayed outside the outpost for 2 nights, refusing to cross the doorway. He paced in small circles, like muttering about footsteps he claimed to hear beneath the ground, insisting the earth was preparing to open again. On the 3rd morning, he vanished. His boots were still in the gravel. His jacket was folded neatly over a chair. No sign of a struggle, no tracks leading away, just the faintest smell lingering in the air. Cold stone, damp roots, and that metallic undertone that didn't belong above ground. The officers who came to investigate suggested he'd wandered off at dawn. They disoriented. Maybe he'd followed a deer path. Maybe he'd suffered a mental break and run into the woods. But I knew better. He didn't run. He was taken back. The thought lodged in me like a splinter. I carried it everywhere, through every patrol, every report, every quiet hour in the watchtower. It sat behind my ribs, waiting, growing. The forest felt different now. Or maybe I just finally saw it clearly. Paths didn't look the same. Clearings seemed to breathe. This is tree trunks angled subtly, as if shifting their weight. Even the birds acted differently. Not silent, but cautious, their calls shorter and spaced farther apart, as though sound itself had become dangerous. I'd walked trails I'd spent half my life monitoring, only to feel watched by something above eye level. I'd stop, listen, scan every branch and bow. Nothing. But the feeling wouldn't fade. It just retreated a few feet into the shadows, waiting for me to continue so it could follow. I tried to ignore it. That was my mistake. The next encounter didn't come from the forest pressing in on me. It came from the radio. It was early summer, the time when the heat sits thick on the ground and the underbrush dries into brittle tinder. I was doing routine checks on fire risk zones when the radio crackled, a soft static that cut through the usual chatter. "Ranger Unit 6, do you copy?" I pressed the receiver. "Unit 6 here. Go ahead." A moment of silence. Then a voice, faint, trembling, one I didn't recognize. Someone's in the woods. My grip tightened. Who is this? No answer. Only a soft, rhythmic tapping behind the transmission. 3 taps, a pause, 3 taps again. The cadence punched through my chest. 3 knocks, always 3. The same pattern the older man had described, the same pattern I had heard myself. The voice returned, barely audible. It's in the trees. I tried to triangulate the location, but the signal was weak, drifting in and out. I stepped onto the trail, scanning the ridge for any sign of smoke, movement, anything. Identify yourself, I ordered. What's your location? Are you injured? The voice choked on air. I didn't believe them. I thought it was just stories, just myths. But it's real. Oh God, it's so much bigger than they said. A snapping sound jolted through the radio, not static. Wood breaking, something heavy falling. Then a long, shuddering breath. A deep exhale that wasn't human. My blood ran cold. Sir? Sir, respond. Where are you? Silence swallowed the channel. Then the radio clicked off on its own. I stood alone on the trail, the heat pressing against my skin, the scent of pine sap thick in the air. But beneath it, faint, almost hidden, the metallic cave scent curled into my lungs. I took off toward the north ridge, the direction the transmission had echoed from. My boots pounded the earth, each step louder than I wanted it to be. The forest leaned close, its shadows pulling tight under the branches. Half a mile in, I found the first sign. A backpack. Torn open, contents scattered across the dirt. A water bottle cracked in half, trail maps shredded, a notebook ripped through the center. The fabric wasn't cut, it was pulled apart, fibers stretched like something had pinched the seams with tremendous force. I knelt beside it, fingers brushing the torn edges. Still warm. Whoever owned it had been here minutes ago. A crow landed on a branch above me and cawed loudly, once sharp, alarmed. Then it flew off so fast the branch shook. A warning. I rose and swept my gaze across the trees. That was when I saw the shape. Not far, 30 yards ahead, partly hidden behind a cluster of firs, tall enough that its head would brush low-hanging branches. Shoulders hunched, arms hanging long and loose at its sides. Its posture didn't threaten, it invited. A low vibration rippled through the ground, a hum that resonated through the roots, through the soil, up into my bones. It was the same sound I'd heard near the cave, a call, a summoning. Not for me, for whoever had spoken on the radio. My chest tightened. My instincts screamed to turn back, to run, to pretend I hadn't seen what I'd seen. But something else, something buried under years of denial, rose to the surface. I stepped forward. The figure didn't react, didn't shift, didn't breathe. It waited. I took another step. The air thickened around me, dense and heavy like fog turned to stone. The trees on either side of the trail leaned subtly inward, their branches curling in ways that looked like hands reaching downward. I whispered into the stillness. Where did you take him? The woods did not answer with sound. They answered with movement. Behind the figure, the ground sank. Just an inch, maybe 2. Enough to show a subtle, pulsing shift of earth, as if something large moved beneath the forest floor. My heart slammed against my ribs. There was more than one. The figure finally tilted its head, not toward me, but downward, as if listening to the heartbeat of the creature below. I forced myself to breathe evenly. What do you want? The figure straightened, a slow, almost lazy motion. Then, with a fluid glide, it stepped backward into the deeper shadows of the forest. Not turning, not breaking eye contact, just retreating, inviting, luring. The forest behind it seemed to open, branches bending in unnatural harmony, creating a path where there hadn't been one a moment earlier. A path toward the sinking earth, toward whatever lived underneath. I felt the ground soften beneath my boots, not enough to sink, just enough to warn. Not safe, not stable, not meant for human weight. I stepped back, pulse thundering. The figure paused, tilted its head again, slower this time. Then the forest exhaled, a cold, rising gust from the ground, carrying the unmistakable smell of underground stone, the cave scent, the scent of places sunlight cannot reach. The figure slipped into the darkness like water into soil. The path closed behind it, branches lifted, shadows dispersed. The opening vanished as if it had never existed. I stood on the trail alone, breath sharp in my throat, the only sign that anything had happened now buried deep beneath my feet. The radio crackled faintly. Then, in a whisper that didn't belong to any voice I recognized, "You've seen enough for now." The transmission died. I didn't move for a long time. When I finally did, the forest felt closer than it ever had. Not hostile, not overtly threatening, but aware. Watching. Waiting. And for the first time in my life, I understood something with absolute clarity. What lived in these woods wasn't protecting territory. It was preparing it. Preparing for movement, for emergence, for something older than the pines themselves, something that had been waiting for the right moment to rise. I walked back to the outpost under a sky that felt too bright, too exposed, too vulnerable. Every sound echoed louder, every shadow lingered longer. The forest had opened a door, and it wasn't done with me, not even close. In the days that followed, sleep became an uneven thing, shallow, slippery, dissolving the moment I closed my eyes. Each time I drifted off, I felt the same sensation rise beneath me. Soil shifting, roots snapping, something big stirring under the surface like the forest had lungs, and they were slowly filling. I'd wake drenched in sweat, my breath jagged, my sheets tangled around my legs. The dreams never held long enough for me to remember details, but the emotion stayed. Tight, compressed, a weight in my chest pressing from the inside outward. I kept going to work anyway. That's what I do. That's what all of us do. We keep walking trails even when the trees whisper warnings. We watch over the forest even when the forest seems to be watching back. And the forest was watching. One morning, while checking a line of remote campsites that hadn't been used since early spring, I found something impossible. Footprints. Not human. Not animal. A pattern pressed deep into the mud. A long stride, wide set, with impressions that curved at the ends like elongated toes. The spacing between each print was too large for a bear, too even for an elk, and too straight for anything natural. The stride went from the tree line directly toward an empty fire pit, but there was only one set. No return path. No wandering. Just a single arrival. As if the visitor had materialized from the trees and vanished again into air. I crouched to inspect the prints, placing my hand next to one. My fingers didn't reach half the width. The depressions sank deeper than the weight of any animal native to this region, as though whatever made it carried tremendous density, like muscle layered over something heavier. I felt the forest tighten around me. Not physically, but atmospherically, as though the trees leaned in to see what I would do next. I whispered into the clearing, "Why here?" The wind carried no answer, but the unease inside me grew. Later that week, a call came from a pair of hikers who reported hearing drumming deep in the woods, a slow, repetitive thud that vibrated the earth. They described it like someone hitting the ground with a massive fist again and again. Then they described something else, voices, low, harmonic tones rising from underground, not music, not language, something older. When I arrived at the site, the hikers refused to go near the ridge they'd heard the sound from. They packed up their gear in silence, faces pale and drained. They left without asking questions. I hiked alone toward the ridge, each step heavy with dread. The air grew colder as I approached. Not gradually, but suddenly, like stepping into the shadow of a structure that wasn't there. Then I heard it. Not loud, not aggressive, just steady. A deep thump, a pause, a deep thump again. Rhythmic, measured, communicative. The sound made the ground tremble so lightly that my boot soles tingled. I followed it. The ridge sloped downward into a shallow depression filled with moss, ferns, and scattered stones. The thumping vibrated strongest at the center, and as I stepped closer, the moss flattened beneath my weight, revealing a circular outline of old stone beneath. Not natural. Placed. A ring. A boundary. My heart crawled into my throat. I knelt and brushed away more moss, exposing carved lines in the rock, concentric circles broken by jagged marks. Symbols? Claw marks? I couldn't tell. But they weren't new. They were ancient. The ground trembled again, and this time the vibration echoed up my legs with enough force to make my bones buzz. I staggered back, breath sharp, instinct screaming. Something was directly beneath the stone ring, large, alive, moving, and then the forest around me fell silent, completely silent. No birds, no insects, no wind. The hush felt deliberate, like nature holding its breath. Then a new sound seeped through the earth, not the thump, not the hum, but something like a slow inhale. Dirt shifting, roots cracking, stone grinding against stone, as if the thing under the ridge had turned its attention toward the surface, toward me. I stumbled backward, eyes locked on the trembling circle of moss. Then the ground bulged, only an inch, but enough to show that the boundary between the world above and whatever lived below was thinner than I'd ever believed. I retreated into the tree line, my breath fogging despite the summer heat. The forest exhaled behind me, a cold draft brushing my neck like someone's hand passing through my hair. I didn't run. I should have. But I walked away slowly, methodically, refusing to show fear, because the forest already knew too much of it. By the time I reached the outpost, the sun was low and the horizon was bruised purple. I sat on the steps, elbows on my knees, staring at nothing. My hands were shaking, not with panic, with certainty. Everything I'd denied my whole life was true. The stories locals whispered, the disappearances, the harmonic knocks, the things that watched from the tree line, and the caves. Not just caves, but entrances, doorways, breathing passages to something older than language, older than memory, older than the forest itself. Something that had been waiting beneath these woods long before we ever patrolled them, long before anyone named this place, long before fire rings and trails and towers. That night, as I tried to sleep, a sound woke me. Not a knock, not a growl, not a voice, a gentle scrape, like fingertips brushing wood. It came from beneath the floorboards. I froze. The scrape came again, slower this time, moving from one end of the cabin to the other, as though something underground was feeling along the surface, mapping the structure with the patience of a creature that had never needed to rush. Then it stopped. A moment later, a soft harmonic tremor resonated up through the floor. A greeting, a reminder, a promise. My breath shook out of me. I didn't move until morning. When I stepped outside, the sunrise looked wrong. Too red, too scattered, like the light was filtered through dust rising from below. I walked into the forest, not because I wanted to, but because I had no choice. My life, my work, everything I was, it had all been a long prelude to understanding what hid beneath these pines. I reached the ridge again as the forest warmed with early light. The moss-covered circle stood exactly as before. Still, quiet, but no longer neutral. I approached slowly and placed my palm on the ground inside the ring. The earth felt warm, almost pulsing, like the heartbeat of something slumbering in soil deeper than I could imagine. "You're not asleep," I whispered. "Not really." And the ground beneath me hummed in acknowledgement. I rose, breath trembling, and looked out across the forest. A breeze stirred the branches, carrying pine scent through the air, and for a moment everything looked peaceful, serene, beautiful, a place worth protecting. But that serenity was a veil, a thin one, because this forest didn't belong to us. It never had. We were witnesses, temporary occupants, observers allowed to roam the surface while something older owned the dark beneath. And the older man, the one who vanished, he had been right. They weren't sleeping. They were waiting for the right moment, waiting for the door to open wider, waiting for someone who could see them without denial, someone who had already been marked, someone like me. I turned away from the ridge, the weight of the truth settling into my bones. My work as a ranger hadn't ended. It had only changed shape. I wasn't protecting the forest from danger. I was protecting people from what lived under it. And maybe someday, protecting the forest from what lived deeper still. As I walked back toward the outpost, sunlight filtering through the towering pines, a realization settled in me with unsettling clarity. Whatever was stirring underground, it had noticed me. It had chosen me. And I could feel its attention like fingers brushing the back of my mind. Not threatening yet, not urgent yet, but patient, curious, waiting for my next step. And I knew with absolute certainty that the next story the locals would whisper would be mine. I learned early in my career that the forest doesn't need monsters to scare you. It only needs time. Time to wait, time to whisper, time to crawl its way into the places inside you that you don't check often enough. But the night that taught me that lesson didn't start with terror. It started with the stillness of pines and a cold wind slipping down the ridge, brushing my face like a warning I wasn't yet willing to hear. My name isn't important, not the one on my badge anyway. What matters more is that I'm 43 years old, and for the past 19 of those years, I've been a ranger in the northern pine forests of Washington state. Folks around here call the place Blackwater Timberlands, but the official maps give it a more bureaucratic name that nobody uses. The locals say the trees came first, the stories came next, and the maps came last. And between you and me, the locals are usually right. What drew me to this forest wasn't adventure or heroism or any of that nonsense. It was the quiet, the honest kind, the kind that fills your lungs and slows your heartbeat. But quiet can lie. Quiet can hide things. And in Blackwater, it often does. I started as the young buck in the ranger station, eager to prove I wasn't just another transfer who'd quit after a winter or two. Back then, the older rangers liked to tease me by saying things like, "Listen for the pine spirits, kid. They're the ones that decide if you stay." I'd laugh, act like I got the joke, but I learned fast. They weren't joking. The locals didn't help either. They'd pass by the station with casseroles, maps, or warnings disguised as small talk. You hear knocking at night, don't answer the door unless you see who's there. If you smell wet fur and nothing's around, walk away. Don't run. And my favorite, if you see something that looks like a man but moves like it's remembering how, get inside. I shrugged most of that off. People living in isolated areas always built legends, but legends aren't born from nowhere. They grow from something. Something someone saw, something someone feared, something someone didn't come back from. I learned that truth the hard way. It was my third winter, long before I understood the difference between confidence and complacency. Snow had come early that year, thick and unwilling to melt. The forest smelled sharp, like pine sap and frozen air. Everything felt untouched, preserved, perfect. I was out on routine patrol, just a long loop past the creek, through the old-growth stands, and back toward the cabin on the north bluff. The sun dipped early that time of year, turning the snow blue and the shadows long enough to look alive. And I'll admit it, I was enjoying myself. A little too much. Enough to forget that beauty in these woods came with a price. Around dusk, the trees started doing that thing they do, where they don't move but somehow shift around you. Every forest does it. But here, the effect was stronger, like the pines were stretching closer, leaning down, listening. I stopped to adjust the collar of my coat, and that's when I heard it. 3 knocks, soft, hollow, like knuckles on old wood. I froze, scanning the trail behind me. Nothing but snow and trees. My cabin was still a mile off, and there wasn't a soul out there who'd be knocking for fun. The knocks came again, this time closer. 3. Slow. Intentional. My rational mind went straight to explanations. A loose branch tapping in the wind, a woodpecker, maybe even snow falling from a limb. But none of those make a rhythm. And none of those follow you. I tightened my grip on my radio. I should have called it in. But at 26, with more stubborn pride than sense, I didn't. I just kept walking, telling myself I wasn't afraid. Fear, I've learned, is a negotiator. It doesn't start with screaming or shaking. It starts with quiet arguments inside your own head. Little doubts, little distortions. That knocking didn't belong here. I finally spoke aloud, mostly just to break the pressure building in my chest. "Hello?" The forest swallowed my voice. My words didn't echo, they just died. I kept walking, faster now, boots crunching through snow like distant bones breaking underfoot. My breath puffed out in thick white clouds. Under the crunch of my steps, I could hear my heartbeat, heavy, insistent. Then came the third round of knocks. Closer still. Right behind me. 3 slow taps. I spun around. No one. But the nearest pine tree, its trunk had a smear on it, a dark vertical line about shoulder height, as though something tall had dragged a finger. No, not a finger, something thicker down the bark. It glistened wet in the pale dusk light. I stepped closer before realizing I didn't want to know what it was. It's when the temperature dropped. Fast. The kind of cold that comes with its own sound. The air tightening, the frost crackling, the silence deepening until your ears ring. I've heard people say you can feel when you're being watched. They're right. Something in those woods was focused on me. Not curious, not confused. Focused. The knocking didn't continue. It didn't need to. Because I now heard something worse. Breathing. Slow, deliberate, heavy. Not the short bursts of an animal, not the frantic rhythm of fear. This was something that knew patience, that had lungs larger than mine, that inhaled like it was drawing the whole forest into itself. I held my breath, hoping the sound was in my head. It wasn't. And the scent hit next. The scent locals had joked about, but described too vividly for me to forget. Wet fur, musky, damp, a smell with weight. I didn't run, not yet, but my steps turned into a fast march, as fast as I could move without kicking up panic. I remembered what my mentor once told me. Running invites the chase. Fear is food in these woods. The breathing followed, not behind me, above me, up in the branches. I didn't look. I didn't want images to haunt me later, because hearing something is one thing. Seeing it stamps it onto your brain. And I wasn't ready yet. Not that night. Not alone. I made it to the cabin with numb fingers and a pulse that wouldn't slow. When I finally risked a glance back at the tree line, the woods looked normal again. But normal means nothing out here. Inside the cabin, I locked the door, secured the shutters, and built a fire as fast as my hands could manage. The crackling flames finally eased some of the tension in my spine. Firelight feels like a friend in these woods. I didn't know then how many nights I would come to rely on it. I sat in the cabin's one chair, listening, waiting, trying to slow my breathing, but right as the fire settled, right as the room warmed, something tapped on the cabin door. 3 knocks. Slow. The same rhythm. I didn't answer. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The knocking didn't repeat. Whatever was out there walked away. I heard the snow compressing under each step, long strides, too long to be human. And as the steps faded, the forest exhaled again, as though whatever had been holding its breath had finally let go. I sat awake until dawn, staring at the door. Nothing returned. But the story didn't end there. That was only the introduction, the forest clearing its throat before it began to speak. I didn't know it yet, but that night was the start of something that would take years to understand. Something that would test the limits of my sanity, my courage, and my stubborn belief that everything had a rational explanation. The locals were right. The pines had spirits, and some of them were still learning how to knock. Fear is a strange teacher. It doesn't speak directly, and it never uses the same lesson twice. Sometimes it shows up as a sound you can't explain. Sometimes it comes as a scent you recognize but can't place. And sometimes it waits until you think you're safe. Then it taps on the door. After that winter night, the forest and I developed a new relationship. I started listening more, watching more, taking seriously the things I used to shrug off as superstition. But the trouble with listening is that once you open your ears, you start hearing things you wish you hadn't. 3 days after the knocking incident, I was assigned to help an older ranger named Price relocate equipment near an abandoned trail system. Price was 59, built like a tree trunk, and spoke like someone who'd seen enough not to raise his voice about it. Folks said he'd worked Blackwater longer than any living soul. When he walked through the forest, even the branches seemed to shift respectfully out of his path. The abandoned trail we were headed toward, Old Quarry Loop, had been closed for years, mostly because of landslides and unstable rock, but the locals still talked about it like it was a place that had made its own decision to stay off limits. We loaded our gear into the snowmobile sled and set out just after dawn. The sky was painfully clear, as if the cold had polished the air. The pines looked almost black against the brightness. Everything was silent except the hum of the engine and the wind knifing past my ears. Price didn't talk much, but when he did, he wasted no time. "You heard anything strange the other night?" he asked without looking at me. My hands tightened reflexively on the handlebars. I kept my eyes straight ahead. "Depends what you mean by strange." "Strange as in strange," he said. "These woods only have one kind." I exhaled slowly, a cloud drifting from my lips. "There was knocking. 3 knocks, didn't see anyone." Price nodded once. That time of year." "That time?" I asked. "You mean winter?" "No," he said. "You'll learn." I didn't press him further. When a man like Price stops answering questions, it means the real answer isn't something you want on your conscience yet. We reached the old trailhead an hour later. Snowmelt from the ridge had carved patterns into the path, leaving exposed roots like ribs poking through thin skin. The air tasted metallic, the way it does before a storm, even when no storm is coming. We parked, unloaded supplies, and hiked toward the collapsed section of trail. That's when I started to smell it again, wet fur, but this time it wasn't faint. It was thick, saturated, heavy enough that I stopped mid-step. Price noticed immediately. "You smell it?" he asked. I nodded. "Yeah, strong." He scanned the tree line, jaw tightening. "Stay close, and if you see something that looks big, don't look long." I tried to swallow, but my throat had gone dry. We reached the first set of equipment, a metal storage locker half buried under snow, and Price began inspecting the hinges. I walked a few yards away to clear branches from the access path. That's when I heard it. A crack. A slow, deliberate branch-breaking crack. Not from weight falling, from weight shifting. I turned my head toward the sound. Between 2 massive pines, maybe 30 yards away, stood something tall. Taller than any man. Its silhouette was wrong, too broad at the shoulders, too long in the arms. The hair stood up along the back of my neck. I couldn't see its face, only a massive shadow pressed into the darker shadows behind it. But it didn't move like an animal. It swayed slightly, as if adjusting its balance. Observing. I blinked hard. When my eyes refocused, the figure was gone. Completely, as though the trees had inhaled it, but the smell, wet fur and cold earth, was stronger. I backed up without turning my back to the woods. My breath hitched in my chest. The fear wasn't sharp yet. It was dull, simmering, rising slowly like water beginning to boil. Price walked over, took one look at my face, and didn't need to ask. "It's watching us," he said. "Don't try to find it. You won't." "What is it?" I whispered. He gave me a long stare. "Something that doesn't like to be named." That didn't help. But the honesty in his voice chilled me more than the wind. We worked fast, faster than protocol allowed. Price wanted us off that trail before the sun dipped. The forest felt tight around us, like the trees were leaning closer. Shadows stretched early, reaching long fingers across the snow. As we prepared to leave, Price stopped suddenly and pointed to a tree trunk ahead. 4 deep gouges carved down its bark, each one thicker than my thumb, each one spaced perfectly apart, like the marks of something with an enormous hand. "Those weren't here last week," Price muttered. My breath fogged out fast and uneven. "Should we report this?" "We will," he said. "But the station already knows. We all know. We just don't talk about it more than we have to." The air shifted around us, dense and slow. A silence dropped so heavy it felt alive. Then a sound rolled through the forest. Not a growl, not a howl, but something between the two, stretched out and layered with a depth that didn't belong to any known animal. It vibrated through my bones. I flinched. Price's face turned to stone. "Time to go," he said simply. We didn't run, but we didn't walk casually either. The snowmobile engine roared to life, echoing off the slopes like an alarm. We sped down the ridge path, and every second I expected something massive to step onto the trail in front of us. The pines blurred past, dark and endless. When we reached open terrain, Price finally relaxed his shoulders. "Don't patrol alone at night for the next few weeks," he said. "Because of that thing?" "That thing," he said, "has been out here longer than we have records. Longer than the tribes have stories. Some winters it keeps to itself. Some winters it wanders. This year, it's wandering." I stared forward, numb fingers gripping the handlebars. "What does it want?" He didn't hesitate. "A witness." The words sank into me like cold water. A witness means it wants you to know it exists. And things that want to be witnessed rarely have peaceful intentions. Back at the station, Price told me to go home, rest, and forget what the trees showed you today. But when I got back to my cabin and closed the door behind me, another sound met me before I could take off my coat. A soft tapping. Not on the door this time. On the window. 3 knocks. Slow. Measured. As if something tall was bending down to check whether I was paying attention. I froze. The tapping stopped. And a shadow, broad, hunched, too still to be human, slid away from the window frame. My breath staggered out of me. Fear tightened around my ribs like a hand. But something else twisted inside me, too. Doubt. Was I seeing what I thought I was seeing? Was my mind filling in gaps? Was the forest playing tricks? Or was I now part of something older than my training, older than reason, older than the human voice itself? That night wasn't the worst, not even close. It was just the beginning of the forest's second lesson. Fear grows fastest when you pretend you're not afraid. I didn't sleep that night, not because I was scared of the tapping. Fear can exhaust itself if you sit still long enough, but because something inside me refused to let my eyes close. Doubt kept me awake, a crawling, internal unease that whispered questions I didn't want to answer. And doubt is the most dangerous thing a ranger can bring into the woods. It blinds you. It convinces you you're misreading tracks, mishearing winds, misjudging danger. It dulls your instincts and sharpens your imagination until you can't tell which is trying to save you and which is trying to ruin you. By morning, my head felt full of fog. I stepped outside into the frost-crusted air, half expecting to find enormous tracks leading away from the cabin, but the snow was untouched, smooth as glass. No footsteps, no drag marks, no disturbances of any kind. That should have comforted me. It didn't, because pristine snow means something else entirely in Blackwater. It means whatever was out there knew how to leave no trace. Back at the ranger station, I found Price cleaning mud from his boots. He didn't even look at me when he asked, "It knocked?" "It tapped on the window," I said, 3 times. He let out a long sigh, one that looked like it had been held for years. "Then it's marked you." "Marked me?" I asked, pulse rising. "For what?" "For observation." The word sent a ripple of cold down my spine. "Don't worry," he added. "It doesn't break doors, not unless you go looking for it first." I didn't find that reassuring. But I kept quiet. The last thing I wanted was to fuel the adrenaline already simmering in my blood. If fear is food, then panic is dessert. And I wasn't going to feed whatever was stalking me. We spent the morning reviewing reports from hikers and hunters. Most were typical. Equipment theft, trail blockages, suspicious smells. But one report stood out. A family camping near the creek had heard footsteps circling their tent. Heavy ones. No human prints found, only deep impressions in the snow that looked like they'd been erased moments after forming. Price and I exchanged glances. "Could be unsafe terrain," I said, though even I didn't believe myself. "Could be," Price replied, "or it could be the same thing watching you." He stood, slid on his coat, and handed me a spare radio. "We're checking it out." We left the station just as clouds began gathering above the ridge, thin layers first, then darker ones curling over the horizon like smoke. The sky dimmed in that way it only does during winter storms, abrupt, heavy, shoulder-crushing. By the time we reached the campsite, the wind had picked up. The creek rippled with jagged reflections of gray sky. But the strangest part wasn't the scenery, it was the smell. Wet fur. Thicker than before. Hanging heavy in the cold, carried on gusts like a warning. I crouched near the fire ring, brushing aside fresh snow to check the ground. No prints, not a single one. But the family had described footsteps, large ones, circling them for nearly 15 minutes. "Price," I said quietly, "how does something that big leave no tracks?" He scanned the tree line. "Doesn't walk like we do." The unease inside me shifted into something sharper. "Meaning?" He hesitated. That alone scared me more than anything else did. "It climbs," he said finally. "Stays above snow level when it wants to. Sometimes leaps, branch to branch." I stared upward instinctively and immediately regretted it. Some of the higher branches, 20 or 30 feet up, sagged unnaturally. Not from snow weight, from something else, something heavy, something that had moved recently. That's when I felt it again. The feeling of being watched, not from the ground, from above. The wind howled, carrying flecks of ice that stung my cheeks. Shadows trembled in the treetops, bending and swaying in ways that didn't match the gusts. "We shouldn't be here long," Price whispered. "Keep your eyes down. Whatever's in the trees prefers curious prey." I lowered my gaze, but curiosity is a stubborn instinct. My eyes flicked up again just once, and I caught the slightest movement high above us. A shape. Large. Dark. Hanging onto a branch effortlessly, then slipping behind another trunk as though melting into bark. I blinked hard. When I looked again, nothing was there, but the branch still swayed gently. We moved back toward the path when a low resonance rolled through the forest. A sound so deep, so layered that it vibrated the snow beneath my boots. Not quite a roar, not quite a growl. Something older. Something that knew language but had forgotten how to use it. The air thickened, my breath hitched. "It's close?" Price muttered. Close was an understatement. A sudden thud hit the ground somewhere to our right. Massive, solid, shaking loose snow from nearby branches. Not a leap, a landing. We didn't run, but we moved. Fast, controlled, footsteps synchronized. Every muscle in my body screamed to look back, but Price's earlier words stabbed through my panic. "Don't look long. Don't look long." We were nearly to the ridge trail when the smell washed over us. Fresh, pungent, unmistakable. Then came a second sound, a rhythmic huffing, almost like breath, almost like thought, almost like anticipation. We broke into a light run, not a panicked sprint, just enough speed to close the distance to safety. Snow kicked up behind us. The forest groaned, branches creaking overhead like something enormous was shifting its weight from tree to tree. Price grabbed my arm suddenly, pulling me behind a fallen log. I dropped into the snow, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my teeth. "Don't move," he whispered. I didn't. For 30 seconds, the world held its breath. Then a shadow passed across the ridge trail. It didn't make sense. Shadows shouldn't move independently, but this one did. Long, broad, hunched. It stretched over the snow like something cast by a shape that wasn't quite human. The breathing stopped. The wind fell silent. The forest seemed to shrink in on itself. And then a single knock echoed through the woods. Not on a door, on a tree. One, solid. Knock, like a warning, or a message. Price whispered, barely audible, "It's claiming territory." "Here?" I breathed. "Here." The shadow shifted, and for a moment, just a fraction of a second, I saw part of it through the trees. A shoulder, massive, covered in thick, dark fur drenched with melting snow. Muscles rippled beneath it, too defined, too large, and an arm, longer than any human's, reached casually toward a trunk, resting upon it like someone leaning against a wall. I blinked. The forest swallowed it again. After a painful stretch of silence, Price tugged my sleeve and nodded. We stood. Walked. Slow steps at first, then faster as we cleared the ridge. When the station finally came into view, my lungs burned with cold panic and the raw effort of holding myself together. Inside, with the door shut and the heaters humming, Price finally spoke. "You understand now," he said. "Understand what?" I asked, voice trembling despite my best efforts. "This forest has its own rules, its own ancestry, its own guardians." "Guardians," I repeated. "That thing is a guardian?" "Of balance," he replied, "of secrets, of quiet. It watches to make sure humans remember whose land this truly is." I stared at the floor, blood roaring in my ears. "So what happens now?" I asked. "To me?" Price met my eyes with a look that was neither reassuring nor cruel, just true. "It'll keep watching you," he said, "until it decides why. I swallowed hard. The heater crackled behind us. Snow tapped softly against the window pane, watching until it decides why. I didn't know then that the answer to that question would come sooner than I wanted, and the forest wouldn't whisper it. It would drag it out, piece by piece, until doubt turned into fear, and fear into something far more dangerous. It would show me the cave, and then everything would change. The cave didn't appear on any of our official maps. It wasn't on the satellite scans either, but the locals talked about it in the same way they talked about sickness or grief or an old debt. The kind of thing you don't mention unless you don't have a choice. The first time I heard about it was from an old woman who lived alone near the southern boundary of Blackwater. She came to the station one morning, wrapped in a wool coat so thick it swallowed her shape, her eyes sharp as pine needles. "There's a hollow in the ridge," she told me. "You stay away from it, Ranger. That place remembers things." I asked her what she meant, and she only shook her head. It remembers what it swallows. I chalked it up to superstition then. I didn't, after the night the knocking got louder. It started just past midnight, 3 knocks, firm enough to rattle the window frame. I sat upright immediately, pulse slamming through my chest. The air in the cabin felt charged, thick with static. I slipped out of bed and approached the window slowly. The frost on the glass had melted in the shape of a handprint, large, much larger than mine. I backed away, every instinct screaming to flee, while logic insisted I stay still. Fear tore in 2 directions inside me. One half wanted to run into the night, to chase answers, to confront whatever had been marking me. The other half, the older, quieter part, knew that curiosity in Blackwater had a price. When the knocking stopped, I waited several minutes before stepping outside. The night was bitter and moonless, and the pines stood in silent formation around the clearing. I aimed my flashlight toward the tree line. No tracks, no movement, no breath but my own. But the scent, wet fur stronger than ever, wrapped around me like a fog. Something was near. I swept the beam across the snow, and that's when I noticed it. A narrow path in the distance where the branches formed a kind of arch. I had walked past that path 100 times and never once noticed it. It felt wrong, but it also felt purposeful, a direction, an invitation. Fear isn't always a warning. Sometimes it's a lure. Against every rule, every instinct, every rational thought, I walked toward the path. The air grew colder with every step. The pines stood closer, their trunks dark and thick, their needles whispering a soft hiss that rose and fell like breath. My flashlight flickered once, then steadied. Something about the darkness ahead felt aware. Not hostile yet, but attentive. After 20 minutes, I reached a slope I'd never noticed on any trail. The ground here was bare, the snow melted in a perfect oval about 15 feet across. That made no sense in winter. None. At the center sat a gaping black hollow in the rock face. The cave. Even from a distance, the entrance looked wrong. Too round, too smooth, as if carved by something with intent. The air flowing out of it was warm, not pleasant warm, wet, thick, stagnant. I tasted iron on my tongue. A faint sound echoed inside, a slow, rhythmic dripping. No wind moved, no branches creaked. The forest seemed to be holding its breath. I stepped closer. It felt like stepping into someone's mouth. The darkness was alive, dense and heavy, as though layers of shadow pressed against the edge of my flashlight. My beam reached only a few feet inside before dissolving into the black. I crouched by the entrance and touched the ground. Warm, not lukewarm, body warm. I pulled my hand back instantly. Something shifted deeper in the cave. A footstep, a scrape, a long exhale. I froze. Then a second sound reached me. A low resonance, almost a hum, vibrating through the stone. Not loud, but deep enough to rattle my ribs. The same layered timber I had heard on the ridge. I whispered to myself, "This is a terrible idea." My breath fogged out in a shaky plume. Behind me, the forest was silent. Ahead, the cave seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. Before I could decide what to do, a silhouette moved in the dark. Huge, slow, deliberate. I stumbled backward so quickly I almost slipped. The shadow didn't emerge. It simply shifted, settling into the shape of something waiting just beyond the reach of light. My flashlight flickered violently. A knock echoed from deep inside. One knock, not three, then another. Two knocks, then another. Three. 1, 2, 3. Faster than I could process, my brain supplied an interpretation my fear wasn't ready to accept. It wasn't knocking, it was signaling. The pattern repeated once more, then the cave fell silent. I backed away, heart in my throat, lungs tight enough to ache. When I turned to leave, a new sound froze me in place. A low, guttural voice, not words, but something close, rolled out from the cavern. Not human, not animal, something in between. The syllables were broken, stretched, as if an ancient throat were trying to remember a language it used to speak. I didn't stay to hear the full attempt. I ran. Branches snapped under my boots. My breath came in ragged bursts. Every few steps, I felt eyes on me. Heavy, predatory, ancient. The forest shrank around me, funneling me back toward the clearing near my cabin. I recognized the trees, the curve of the trail, the familiar shadows. For a moment, I thought I was safe. But the scent hit me again, thick and suffocating. Wet fur. Earth. Blood. Not old blood. Fresh. A long, dark smear stained the snow near the cabin steps. Something large had been dragged or had dragged itself toward my door. I stopped dead. The smear ended abruptly, as if whatever made it had simply lifted off the ground. My breath froze. Something had been here, recently, and it was still close. Behind me, a branch snapped. I spun around, flashlight trembling in my grip. No figure, no movement, just silence. But then the breathing started. Not loud, just steady, slow, intentional. Right above me, I jerked the light upward, and a massive shape slid silently across the top of the cabin roof, its outline too large, too fluid, too wrong. I stumbled backward, falling onto the snow. My flashlight clattered beside me, rolling in a circle. For a split second, the creature paused at the roof's edge. The silhouette was unmistakable. Tall shoulders, long arms, fur bristling in the cold. Its head turned slightly, as though studying me. Then it leapt, but not toward me, toward the trees. One bound, a second, a third. By the time I scrambled to my feet, the forest had already swallowed it whole. I stood there shaking, the cold biting through my clothes, my breath catching on every inhale. Something inside me shifted then, something fundamental. It wasn't fear anymore. It was understanding. Whatever lived in that cave wasn't wandering. It wasn't lost. It wasn't confused. It was deliberate. And it was choosing me, not as prey, not as threat, but as witness. Just like Price had warned, the cave had shown me the truth buried beneath Blackwater timberlands, and the truth wasn't a creature. It was a secret the locals whispered about but never fully named, a secret the pines protected, a secret the cave remembered, a secret that wasn't finished with me. Not yet. Because the next night, the knocks changed, and that was when the real horror began. The knocks changed the following night, just past 2 a.m, not the usual 3, not the measured tapping that felt like a warning. This time the knocks were frantic, urgent, desperate. 5 knocks, a pause, 5 more, another pause, then 3. 5, 5, 3. The pattern thudded through the walls of my cabin like a heartbeat out of rhythm. I jolted upright from a half-sleep, pulse spiking so fast it left me dizzy. For a moment, I couldn't tell if the sound was coming from outside or from somewhere deeper, inside the walls, inside me. The air felt wrong, heavy, damp, too warm for a winter night. My breath didn't fog when I exhaled. I sat perfectly still, waiting for the next round. It didn't come. Instead, a dragging sound scraped slowly across the cabin's outer wall, long, deliberate, as though claws were tracing the grain of the wood. The sound scraped down, then stopped at floor level. Something was crouching, right beside the door. I stepped onto the floor as quietly as possible and grabbed my radio. Static hissed. No signal. That alone was strange. We had boosters for a reason. They didn't fail unless something blocked them. Something big. The dragging sound resumed. A slow, creeping movement that traveled across the wall toward the front window. My mouth dried so fast I couldn't swallow. I backed away from the window, every muscle vibrating. Then the silhouette passed behind the frosted glass. Broad shoulders, a sloping head. Arms so long they brushed the lower edge of the frame. It stopped, paused, turned, and leaned close enough that the frost shifted with its breath. I clamped a hand over my mouth to keep from gasping. My heartbeat hammered in my ears so loudly I almost didn't hear the next sound. A voice, not a human voice, not an animal voice. A layered, broken whisper, like something trying to imitate speech it no longer remembered. The words stretched apart, frayed and guttural. Me. I froze. The thing outside my window had spoken. Not clearly, not fluently, but it had formed a shape of meaning. Home, or something that sounded like it. Every hair on my arm stood up. The cabin felt too small now, too thin, like a flimsy shell barely containing the weight pressing against it from the outside. I grabbed my coat, not because I thought it would protect me. Nothing could. But because instinct told me I couldn't stay inside anymore. Staying meant being cornered. Staying meant being watched without escape. I moved toward the back door, keeping my steps light. As I reached for the lock, the creature's shadow shifted again, this time toward the front of the cabin, moving with impossible quiet for something its size. I slipped outside into the cold. The moment I stepped into the clearing, the forest silence swallowed me whole. The moon hung low, swollen behind thin clouds, washing the snow in a chalky glow. I hurried toward the tree line, boots crunching loud enough to betray every step. Behind me, the cabin door creaked. Not because the wind touched it, because something tall was pushing it open. I didn't look back. I ran. Not fast. Running fast meant falling. Running fast meant making noise. I ran steady, controlled, breath sharp and cold in my throat. The forest closed around me as I reached the deeper pines, the branches forming a canopy that drowned out the moonlight. Then the smell enveloped me, wet fur, sap, iron. That same thick, suffocating scent from the cave. It was close, too close. I veered toward the southern ridge, where I knew Price kept a backup supply shed. The forest floor sloped downward. Snow thinned around the base of the ridge, revealing patches of frozen pine needles. Behind me, something landed on the ground, not quietly, a deep, dull thud that shook the earth beneath my boots. I kept running, heart pounding so hard it felt like it was punching through my ribs. My breath came in frantic white bursts. Every tree felt like a potential witness. Every shadow looked like it was waiting to move. The thudding footsteps followed. Slow at first, then faster. Then impossibly fast. I reached the ridge and scrambled up the incline. Snow gave way under my boots, sending me sliding backward an inch before I caught a root and hauled myself up. I didn't dare turn around, not because I didn't want to see what was behind me, but because I already knew I would. Instead, I listened. Heavy breaths, snow compressing, the steady rhythm of long strides closing the distance. My lungs burned, my legs trembled, my vision pulsed at the edges. I reached the top of the ridge, and then the sound stopped. No breathing, no steps, no scent. Just silence. A silence so sudden and so complete that my ears rang. I bent over, hands on my knees, sucking in air. The forest around me didn't move. Even the wind had died. For a moment I wondered if the thing had vanished. Then I heard it, a voice. Soft, low, broken. Not from behind me, from ahead, somewhere beyond the ridge. Lou. Hollow. My stomach dropped. It wasn't following me out of curiosity. It wasn't chasing me out of instinct. It was herding me toward the cave. I staggered backward, shaking my head, trying to force my breath to steady, but the forest had made up its mind. Branches shifted. The wind stirred just enough to reveal a narrow path between the trees, the same path I had followed the night before, the path leading to the hollow in the ridge. The cave. No, I whispered. No, no, no. A knock echoed from somewhere behind me. One single knock, then two, then three. 1, 2, 3. The signal, the summons. My skin crawled with dread so deep it felt like my bones were vibrating. I turned and ran the opposite direction, away from the path, away from the cave. My boots smashed through snow, breath ragged, eyes blurring from the tears of panic spilling over. Branches whipped past me, my lungs burned. I didn't care. I ran until my legs gave out and I dropped to my knees at the base of an enormous pine. Only then did I hear footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate, spaced far apart. It wasn't rushing anymore. It didn't need to. I pressed my back against the tree, head bowed, trying to silence my breathing. The footsteps stopped just out of sight. I felt it watching. I felt it waiting. Minutes, or hours, I couldn't tell, passed in a crushing silence. My heartbeat slowed from panic to exhaustion, then to something else entirely. A strange clarity, a realization. The creature wasn't here to kill me. It wasn't even here to hurt me. It was here because I had seen the cave. Because I had been near something the forest didn't want, something the creature was tasked to protect. The cave wasn't its home. The cave was its burden. And I had stepped too close to the truth buried inside it. The creature inhaled deeply, the sound rattling the needles above me. Then, slowly, impossibly gently, it exhaled. A warm gust of air washed across my face. It smelled of soil and pine sap and something older than either. Then it stepped away. One heavy footfall, another, a third. I kept my eyes closed until the scent faded and the forest loosened its grip around me. When I finally looked up, the ridge path was gone. The trees had shifted again, not randomly, protectively, as though they were covering something, guarding it, hiding it. I crawled to my feet and stared into the darkness. My fear slowly gave way to something quieter, something that felt almost like understanding. I would never speak of the cave. I would never return to it. I would never try to name what lived inside those shadows, because some secrets aren't meant to be solved. Some truths belong to the pines, not to the people who walk beneath them. I made it back to my cabin just as the sun rose. The door I had left unlocked the night before was closed, latched gently, as though by a careful hand. Inside, the radio worked again. The air felt normal again. The forest felt patient again. I sat down in my chair, leaning forward, resting my elbows on my knees. I had faced fear. I had faced doubt. I had faced panic. I had faced escape. Now only reflection remained. Blackwater Timberlands is full of stories the locals still whisper. Stories of shadows, of watchers, of guardians. Stories outsiders laugh at until the woods decide to show them the truth. Not all monsters are evil. Not all guardians are gentle. And not all spirits of the pines are spirits at all. Some are reminders that the forest remembers what it swallows, and it chooses who to show its secrets to. I was chosen, not because I was special, not because I was strong, but because I listened. And now, when hikers ask me about the strange knocks they hear at night, or the shadows they swear moved in the treetops, or the scent of wet fur carried on a still wind, I tell them the truth. Don't be afraid. Just don't follow the knocking, and never go near the hollow in the ridge. Because the pines are always listening, and the cave always remembers, and some stories, the forest still whispers for a reason. The first time I understood that the forest didn't care who I was or how long I'd served her was the night she whispered my name without using a voice. It wasn't a sound, not exactly. More like a pressure against the back of my skull. Gentle, familiar, and wrong. That was the moment everything changed. And that's where this story begins, with a simple truth I learned too late. Some trees remember what we forget, and some shadows know how to wait. My name is Elias. I'm 38 years old, and for most of my life, I've worked as a ranger in the northern pine country of Washington State, a place locals call the Threadline Forest, because the trails wind so tightly through the pines you could swear you're walking along the fraying strings of some enormous unseen web. You can't look at those trees straight on without noticing how they lean just slightly toward the center of the forest, as if they're all listening to something deeper in. And if you spend enough nights out here, you'll start to see why folks still whisper stories about things that walk upright but don't belong to any species we've cataloged. I grew up in a small cabin on the edge of this forest. My father trapped, my mother taught at the schoolhouse, and I roamed the ridgelines like they were my inheritance. People assume a childhood like that makes you fearless, but truth is, it only teaches you what to fear properly. My dad used to tell me that if I ever heard something walking in the woods at night that moved like a man but didn't breathe like one, I wasn't supposed to stare or shout. Just keep my head down, keep my pace steady, and never let curiosity outrun caution. Back then, I thought he was talking about cougars, drifters, maybe the occasional drunk who wandered too far from the road. Now, I'm not so sure. By the time I'd earned my badge, the forest felt like home. Steady, predictable, a place I could read like a map etched into my own ribs. And for the most part, it was, until the stories started circling again. The old ones. Stories about figures with white moss instead of hair, about long arms glimpsed between trunks, about heavy footsteps in places where no hiker could have reached that fast. The local tribal communities have their own legends, some that sound older than the trees themselves. They speak of spirits who test the hearts of anyone who enters their domain, shapes of bone and pine pitch, echoes of those who never found their way out. The stories kept my curiosity sharp, but I tried to stay grounded. I trusted what I could touch, bark, soil, weather patterns, but even I knew the forest had pockets of strangeness, places where compasses spun in slow circles, ravines where fog pooled even on windless days. A cave system that seemed to hum more than echo. My job was to protect these woods and the people wandering in them. But the truth is, the longer I served, the more I felt like something inside the forest was studying me right back. One of my earliest nights that unsettled me came during a search for a missing local named Whitman. He was known for hiking long trails without telling anyone, but this time he'd left behind his truck, his phone, and footprints that went deep into the threadline and never came out. We found his campsite still warm, the ground dented with the shape of a sleeping bag, but the bag itself was missing. No torn fabric, no blood, no tracks leading away. Just the ghost of a man's night spent alone in the dark. I remember kneeling down and touching the soil. It felt unnaturally cold, colder than the air around it. That kind of detail sticks with you. It burrows into your instincts and waits. That night, as we headed deeper into the tree line, a sound began following us. It wasn't a call or a snap of branches. It was a soft rhythm, like a slow knock against wood. Tap, tap, tap. It stayed at our backs no matter how quietly we moved. My partner Avery thought it was a woodpecker. I wanted to believe that too, but the sound had weight, a body behind it, intent behind it. When we finally turned, flashlights sweeping the trunks, the tapping stopped instantly, as though whatever made it had been holding its breath. We didn't find Whitman. Not that night, not ever. His disappearance slid into the growing list of unanswered questions the forest seemed content to collect. I didn't tell anyone about what I'd heard, not then. I didn't want to be the ranger who started repeating ghost stories just because the woods were too quiet. But the quiet was the problem. Silence out here is never empty. It's full of movement you can't name. The next incident that stuck with me happened 2 years later during early winter. Snow had dusted the ground but hadn't built up enough to muffle footprints. I was doing a routine patrol near the ridge when I smelled something sweet, unexpectedly sweet, like overripe berries. That caught my attention because nothing grows berries up there in winter. The scent drifted in warm waves, unnatural in the cold air, like it came from something breathing. I followed it, cautiously at first, then faster when I saw prints in the snow. They were human-shaped but wrong, longer than a man's step, deeper than they should have been, with a narrow heel and splayed toes. No claw marks, no dragging, just deep, deliberate impressions, spaced far apart like the stride of something tall. I crouched and touched the nearest print. The snow around it had melted slightly, as if whatever made it radiated heat. I remember pulling my hand back quickly, as though heat could leap from the ground and latch onto me. I should have turned around. I should have radioed it in. But I followed the tracks. My mind was split, half ranger, half terrified boy remembering my father's warnings. Curiosity pushed me forward. Instinct clawed at my spine, telling me to stop. The tracks led to a clearing I'd never seen before. That shouldn't have been possible. I knew this forest. I hiked it every week. But the clearing felt wrong. Not new, just newly revealed, like the trees had stepped aside for a moment to show me something I shouldn't see. At the center stood a pine tree with bark stripped in long vertical lines. The strange sweet smell was strongest here, pouring off the tree like steam. The air shimmered faintly around it as if rising from heat. I moved closer, drawn in by something between fascination and dread. Then the woods shifted. It was a subtle change, like someone adjusting the pressure in the entire forest. The silence went rigid. The air felt thick. And that's when I felt it, the presence of something watching me. Not from a distance, from close. Too close. The hairs on the back of my neck rose one by one. And then, from the shadow between two pines, a figure stepped forward. Tall, thin, covered in white, clinging moss like hair, its limbs long enough to brush against the snow without bending. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The creature tilted its head, slow and deliberate, like it was studying me the way a researcher might study a trapped animal. Its face was mostly shadow, but I saw dark pits where eyes should have been. Then it took a step toward me. My legs didn't work. My instincts screamed, but fear pinned me in place. The world compressed into the sound of its foot pressing into snow with impossible weight, and then I heard my name. Not spoken. Not breathed, but pressed into my mind like a thumbprint. Elias. My vision blurred at the edges. My heart slammed against my ribs. I stumbled back, nearly slipping. The creature didn't move. It just watched, head still tilted, as if waiting for some reaction I couldn't give. That's when something inside me broke free. Panic, raw and primal. I ran. I crashed through the trees, branches clawing at my jacket, breath ripping out of me in ragged gasps. I didn't stop until the forest thinned and the world finally felt normal again. But that night was only the beginning. I didn't sleep that night, not because I didn't try, but because every time I closed my eyes, I felt something standing just beyond the edge of my thoughts, like the imprint of that creature's gaze had followed me home. My cabin sits near the southern boundary of the thread line, far enough from the roads that the silence settles thick most nights. Usually that quiet comforts me. But after what I'd seen, it felt like a blanket being pressed too tightly over my mouth. The next morning, when the sun finally dragged itself over the ridge, I convinced myself I'd hallucinated something. That the isolation, the cold, the scent, the strange clearing, maybe it all played tricks on me. Maybe exhaustion made me see a shape that wasn't there. I almost believed it. Almost. Because when I stepped outside, the snow around my cabin showed a single track. One footprint, long, deep, toes splayed, pressed into the earth like a signature. And it was facing the cabin. I stood there for a long time, staring at it, unable to make sense of anything except the cold rising through my boots. The footprint was older than the ones from the clearing, the edges softened by night frost, but unmistakable. Something had followed me back. Something had watched where I slept. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe something worse. I brushed the track away with my boot, but the pressure it left in my chest didn't go anywhere. That was the first morning I questioned whether I was still the one watching the forest, or whether the forest had started watching me. I kept the incident quiet. I didn't want the whispers. Rangers aren't supposed to bring superstition into their work, and admitting what I'd seen would put me at the center of every campfire rumor within 50 miles. But the thread line doesn't give you time to process things at your own pace. 3 weeks later, I got a call about a sound complaint from a nearby cabin owned by a retired logger named Tully. The man lived by himself, stubborn as a mule, claimed to know the woods better than anyone. He didn't scare easy, but that morning his voice shook when he called. Something knocked on his door in the middle of the night, he said. Something tall. He could see its shadow through the frosted glass. He told me he didn't open the door, but whatever it was stood there for almost an hour. He heard it breathing. Slow. Heavy. Not quite human. I grabbed my gear and drove out to him. His cabin sits deep into the northeastern side of the forest, where the pines grow so close you can barely slip your fingers between the trunks. The place looked normal when I arrived. Smoke drifting from the wood stove exhaust, morning frost clinging to the porch rail, but Tully looked like he hadn't slept in days. His eyes were rimmed red. He kept glancing at the tree line like something might appear at any moment. He led me to the front door. The frost on the glass had melted in one perfect oval, as if something warm had leaned in close to peer inside. Below in the snow were footprints, same shape, same size, same narrow heel and splayed toes. My stomach dropped. I crouched to inspect them. They were deeper on the right side, like whatever made them favored that leg. The stride was long, too long for any man, even a giant. Tully watched me silently, breathing through his teeth. I asked him what it sounded like. He said the knocking wasn't like a person's. Too slow, too rhythmic, like someone tapping with fingertips longer than they should be. He said the breath on the other side of the door fogged the entire window in one long exhale. He didn't want to stay there alone anymore. I should have filed it as a simple wildlife disturbance. Should have chalked it up to paranoia. Should have downplayed the prince, but I couldn't. Because now two men, me and Tully, had seen signs of something we couldn't name, and the worst part was realizing the creature wasn't just wandering, it was choosing, watching, testing. I recommended he stay with family in town for a few days. He didn't argue. That alone scared me more than the footprints did. After he left, I stayed behind to inspect the property. I circled the cabin, checking for signs of damage or forced entry. Nothing. But behind the woodpile, half hidden, I found something that made the air seem to tighten around my throat. A strip of bark, long and narrow, peeled cleanly from a pine trunk. It was marked with 4 parallel scratches, deep, straight, evenly spaced. Not claw marks, not knife marks. Something had carved that symbol deliberately. I took it with me, wrapped in a tarp, but even sealed away, the bark carried that strange, sweet scent I remembered from the clearing. That night, the smell followed me into my dreams. I dreamed of the creature standing at the foot of my bed, moss-covered hair dripping onto the floorboards. I dreamed of its long fingers reaching out as if to measure the distance between us. I dreamed of its voice, not spoken, but pulsed into my thoughts like a heartbeat. You walk where you shouldn't. I woke drenched in sweat, lungs aching, heart pounding so hard my ribs hurt. My cabin felt smaller, walls pressing in, shadows too thick. For the first time in years, I drove into town in the middle of the night just to be around other people, just to hear noise, just to feel like something human existed outside the forest. But the thread line wasn't done with me. A few days later, I heard from a pair of hikers who claimed to have seen glowing eyes between the trees, too high off the ground to belong to any animal common to the region. The hikers were experienced, calm, not prone to fear-mongering. They said the eyes followed them for half a mile, blinking slowly, never approaching, never falling behind, just watching. I took their statement seriously. On the surface, it sounded like an owl sighting, but owls don't walk, and owls don't leave human-shaped tracks in fresh snow. The stories piled up. A hunter glimpsed a tall shape crossing a ridge at dusk. A camper heard long strides circling his tent. Overnighters swore they saw a figure crouched behind a tree, moss dripping from its shoulders like wet fur. I felt the thread line tightening around me. Every call, every report, every unexplainable detail, it all traced back to places near that clearing I'd found. A place the forest had revealed once and then hidden again. And the worst part was the sense I couldn't shake. It wasn't wandering randomly. It was moving closer. It was learning. It was adapting to the shape of the world we lived in. One evening, after a long day of checking trail markers and filing incident reports, I returned home to find my cabin colder than usual. Not cold like winter. Cold like the kind that sinks into the bones of the place. I stepped inside, closed the door behind me, and immediately felt the air shift. Not a draft, not a breeze, something else. I froze by instinct, listening. The cabin was silent. No wood settling, no wind outside, no drip from the kitchen sink. I stood there in the doorway, every muscle locked, my breath shallow. Then I heard it. A single knock, not on the front door, from inside the cabin, from the back room. The knock was soft, almost polite, but it carried a weight that made my teeth ache. I didn't move. My heartbeat felt too loud. For a moment, I wondered if I was dreaming, if the exhaustion had finally tipped me over into imagining things. But then it came again. Knock. I forced myself to take a step forward, then another. My hand hovered near my holster, not because I believed a weapon would help, but because the familiar weight grounded me a little. The hallway stretched longer than it should have. The shadows looked deeper. My pulse thudded in my ears. When I reached the door to the back room, I pressed my palm against the wood. It was warm. I swallowed hard, turned the knob, and pushed the door open. The room was empty, but the window was open, just a crack. Fresh snow dusted the sill. And there, on the floor beneath it, melted into the wooden planks, was the impression of a single footprint. Long, deep, toes splayed and still faintly steaming. I stepped back without meaning to, as if my body moved on instinct before my mind could catch up. The footprint's edges glistened with meltwater, the heat still radiating faintly from the center. Something had been inside my cabin moments before I walked in. Maybe seconds. Maybe it had slipped out the window just as it heard my truck crunch along the frozen path. The thought left a hollowness in my chest I couldn't name. I dealt with bears in kitchens, cougars at back doors, wolves testing boundaries, but nothing prepares you for the warmth of a footprint left by something that shouldn't exist. I shut the window, latched it, then latched it again as though metal could stop whatever had been inside. I stood there a long moment, staring out into the tree line. The forest looked normal in that soft winter dusk, quiet, still, indifferent. But I knew better. Something out there wasn't indifferent. Something out there had started to move like a shadow, sliding between the trees and into my life. For the first time since I'd taken this job, I slept with every light in the cabin on. And still, sleep didn't come. Every creak of the wood, every shift in the wind made my pulse jump. When I finally dozed off, the dream came again. The creature stood in the corner of the doorway, its moss-covered hair dripping onto my floor, its head tilted too far to one side. The dream was silent except for a low vibration in the air, an unspoken hum that burrowed into my ribcage. In the dream, I couldn't move, couldn't even blink. The creature reached out a long finger and touched the center of my chest. Wake. I snapped upright in bed, breath gone, sweat cold on my skin. The light still burned. Everything looked normal, but my hands were shaking so badly I had to sit on them to keep them still. I started journaling that morning, not for clarity, but for grounding. I wrote down the footprint, the warmth, the knock, the smell from weeks before. But the more I wrote, the more another realization pressed itself into my thoughts. All these encounters happened after Whitman's disappearance. After that clearing. After that night I heard my name spoken without a voice. Maybe I had walked somewhere I wasn't meant to be. The Threadline Forest is full of stories, most of them dismissed as folklore. But one story, a local legend, rose back into memory like something dredged up from cold water. The elders spoke of a presence older than the roots of the pines, a guardian or a hunter depending on the tale, a spirit that didn't kill outright. It tested, observed, chose. It was said to live where the land bent inward, where the trees whispered the names of those who wandered too close. They called it the tall moss man, or in older dialects, something closer to the listener. I'd heard those stories since I was a child, but they'd always felt distant, like echoes of a culture I admired but didn't fully understand. Now the echoes felt closer, sharper, personal. The next few days didn't bring rest. They brought reports. A snowshoer observed a tall, pale figure crossing a frozen creek upstream. Its reflection warped in the ice like it was made of water instead of bone and muscle. A teenager claimed her tent zipper slid open in the middle of the night by an unseen hand. Another camper found long strands of white moss tangled in the guy lines of his shelter, arranged in a perfect spiral. People described a smell they couldn't name, sweet, warm, clinging to the back of the throat. Every story traced a rough path through the northern stretch of the Threadline, like something migrating with purpose. I checked those sites myself, one by one. Each time the forest felt a little different, not visibly, not physically, but emotionally. as though its attention kept shifting to follow me. The silence began feeling loaded again, thick with a presence I couldn't see. One afternoon, late in January, the air snapped with cold so suddenly my breath turned to fog before I even stepped out of my truck. I'd been called to investigate strange noises near a small network of caves at the base of one of the ridges. The caves were natural, formed by erosion and glacial drift, but they held a reputation among locals. People reported strange echoes there, voices that didn't belong to the person speaking. I parked near the trailhead and stood there for a moment, listening. The forest seemed calm. Pine branches swayed slightly, brushing each other with a soft hiss. No tapping, no footsteps, no smell. For a brief moment, I felt relief. Then I stepped into the tree line. The silence changed instantly. The woods around the caves have always felt colder, but this cold sank into my bones like ice water poured down my spine. Even the air tasted metallic on my tongue. I moved slowly, scanning the ground, the trunks, the shadows between branches. Halfway to the caves, I saw the first sign. A tree, one I knew well from years of patrol, had a fresh strip of bark peeled away. Not torn, not scratched, peeled, clean, the mark identical to the one I found behind Tully's cabin. I forced myself to keep going. The cave entrances appeared between two massive boulders. Normally, a faint wind pushes out from the largest opening, but today there was no wind at all. The air stalled around the mouth of the cave like the forest was holding its breath. I knelt, checking for footprints. Snow inside the cave had melted in an odd pattern, a series of long, oval depressions, shallow but distinct. Something had walked inside, something large enough that the ground had warmed where it stepped. I reached for my radio. My fingers hovered over the button. Then I lowered it. Calling for backup meant trying to explain the unexplainable. And worse, it meant someone else would walk into whatever I was about to face. I couldn't risk that, so I stepped in alone. The cave swallowed sound immediately. My boots crunched softly, but the echoes came back wrong. Delayed, distorted, almost like a second set of footsteps followed mine, a half second too late. I halted. The echoes halted. I moved again. The delayed footsteps followed. My skin prickled with cold. I pressed deeper. The air warmed unnaturally the farther I went. And then a scent, sweet, heavy, filled the space. That same scent from the clearing. The same scent from the bark strip in my cabin. My heartbeat thudded painfully. The narrow passage opened into a wider chamber, lit faintly by light filtering through cracks in the rock. The air shimmered, and in the center of that chamber, piled in a spiral pattern, were strands of white moss. Dozens of them, arranged deliberately. I approached slowly. The sweet smell grew thicker, burning the back of my nose. And then I heard it. A breath. A breath. Not mine. Not human. Slow, deep, vibrating through the stone floor. I spun around. The creature stood at the mouth of the chamber, taller than I remembered, shoulders scraping the rock above. Moss draped like wet hair, dragging across the stone. Its arms nearly touched the ground. Shadows clung to its shape like a second skin, making its face impossible to read. It stepped forward, the sound like a tree trunk sinking into mud. Every instinct screamed, run, scream, hide. But I was pinned again, my muscles refusing to obey. The creature lifted its head slightly, as though smelling the air between us. The sweet scent thickened, hot, almost suffocating. My pulse hammered. The walls felt too narrow. Then a sudden wave of warmth hit my mind, like a push of thought that wasn't mine. Why do you follow? The voice wasn't heard. It was felt, pressed into the space between my heartbeat and breath. My vision dimmed at the edges, the chamber tilting. I stumbled back, gasping. The creature moved closer. I felt the air shift around it, bending in a way that made my stomach twist. The moss along its shoulders rippled as though alive, clinging, reaching. My legs trembled under me. Then another pulse of thought, colder this time. Leave. The words struck like a blow. Pain exploded behind my eyes. I dropped to a knee, clutching my head as the cave spun. The creature's presence swelled, filling the space like a wave rising to break. Then suddenly, silence. Silence. A gust of wind cut through the chamber. I blinked. The creature was gone. Just gone. I staggered back, barely managing to keep my footing. My lungs struggled for air that felt too thin. Something warm trickled from my nose. Blood. I didn't wait for a second warning. I turned and ran, the cave walls blurring past, the echoes twisting around me like whispers. When I finally burst out into the daylight, the forest looked unchanged. Calm. Ordinary. But I knew the truth. Whatever lived in those caves didn't want me there. And it wasn't done with me. Not by a long shot. I made it back to my truck with my legs still shaking. My breath came in sharp bursts, each one cutting through my throat like winter air scraping against raw skin. I slammed the door behind me and locked it out of instinct, even though metal and glass wouldn't keep that thing out if it wanted in. The forest outside my windshield looked deceptively calm. Branches swaying gently, patches of snow drifting from the canopy, the ordinary rhythm of life continuing as though nothing inside that cave had just reached into my mind. I sat there for a long while, hands clutching the steering wheel, the ghost of that whispered command echoing through my bones. Leave. It should have been easy. I should have driven away, headed to town, filed a vague incident report, reassigned future cave patrols to someone else. But the truth pressed down on me with a weight I couldn't ignore. Whatever lived in that cave had been following me long before I stepped inside, and it had crossed the threshold of my home. Leaving wouldn't undo that. Leaving wouldn't erase the footprint on my floor, or the breath on Tully's window, or the warm print in the snow outside my cabin. Leaving might only convince it to follow farther. So I drove deeper into Threadline instead of away from it. I didn't have a plan, just a growing dread that if I didn't understand what was happening, someone else would be next. Maybe a hiker, maybe a kid, maybe another ranger, and it would be on me for knowing too much and saying too little. The forest road curved along the ridge like a spine, the pines rising tall on either side, forming a tunnel of shifting shadow. As I descended into the northern basin, the sunlight dimmed as though filtered through smoke. The air grew colder again, unnaturally cold. And then, halfway down the slope, I saw them. Footprints. They cut through the fresh snow in a straight, deliberate line, each one long, deep, splayed at the toes, pointing down the slope toward the old fire watch cabin. My stomach tightened. That cabin hadn't been used in years, not officially. Too remote, too unstable. But locals still swore they saw lantern light flicker in the windows some nights. I never put stock in those tales. Until now. I followed the prints, no longer caring whether it was smart or safe. Curiosity had turned into something else, something like responsibility swollen with dread. The trail led to the small clearing where the cabin leaned against the hillside, its wooden frame weathered and sagging. Snow blanketed the roof. The single window was dark. The prince stopped at the door. Not turned away, not circled, stopped. Something had walked right up to that cabin, and then vanished. I approached slowly, boots crunching over the snow. My breath fogged the air in shallow bursts. The doorknob was frosted over, untouched. A thin strip of wood hung loose from the frame, pried back as though something long and thin had slipped into the crack. Whatever entered hadn't needed the door. I pushed the door open. The air inside felt wrong immediately. Warmer than outside, thick, sweet, with that heavy scent that had shadowed me since the clearing. My flashlight beam swept the room. Dust curled in the air. Old maps curled on the walls. A lantern sat on the table, rusted through. Everything looked untouched for years, except the floorboards near the back wall had warped outward, bowed as if something heavy had pressed up from below. I stepped closer. The wood creaked softly under my weight. A faint crack of ice snapped somewhere beneath the cabin. The scent intensified until my stomach twisted, and then I noticed it. Threads of white moss trailing along the crack between two floorboards, like veins pushing upward. I knelt, ran a gloved finger along the crack. The moss was warm. That warmth sank through the glove like breath against skin. Something had come up from under this cabin, something living down in the soil or deeper, maybe in the cave networks that stretched beneath these ridges like the roots of an old beast. I stood again, pulse quickening, a strange pressure building in the air like I'd stepped into the center of a held breath. Then The knocking started, not from the door, from beneath me. A single knock, slow, deliberate, rose from the wood and rattled up my legs. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the remains of a chair. The knock came again, then again. Knock, knock, knock. Each one perfectly spaced, rhythmic, communicating, calling. I backed toward the doorway, every nerve in my body urging me to run, but something in me froze the moment I reached the threshold. Not fear. Not exactly. Something deeper, older, like the forest itself had grabbed hold of my spine and whispered, "Listen." The knocking stopped. Silence pressed in, and then, so faint I thought I imagined it, a breath exhaled beneath the cabin floor, warm, heavy, close. A presence rose up from below, filling the air with a pressure that made my vision blur at the edges. And then the thought hit me, not spoken, not even forced. Stay. I wanted to step back inside. Every instinct screamed to leave, but another feeling, a strange sinking familiarity, pulled me toward the warped boards. Stay. It wasn't a command. It was a request, an invitation, something like curiosity radiating from below the cabin. I swallowed hard and forced myself backward out through the doorway, boots slipping on packed snow. The moment I stepped outside, the pressure vanished like an inhaled breath released. My lungs felt lighter again. My heartbeat steadied. Whatever lived beneath that cabin didn't want me gone. It wanted to understand me. As I turned back toward the forest path, I felt that same sensation from the cave, that unspoken presence trailing the edges of my thoughts. Watching, measuring. I made it halfway to my truck before noticing the new footprints. They weren't mine. They weren't old. They hadn't been there before. Fresh prints, long and deep, walked parallel to mine, as though something had followed me from the cabin but kept its distance, matching my steps, shadowing my path but never closing in. My breath caught. I turned slowly, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved. The silence was absolute. Then, somewhere far off between the pines, a crack echoed through the stillness, a single branch snapping under heavy weight, followed by another, then another. Growing closer. The forest leaned toward the sound, every trunk angled slightly as though drawn to attention. I took one step back. The sound stopped. The pines stilled. The wind died. I felt that presence again. Not a figure, not a shadow, but a weight in the air that pressed against my ribs with delicate pressure. Not hunting, not threatening. Waiting. I forced myself to breathe, forced my legs to keep moving until I reached the truck, though my hands shook so badly I dropped the keys twice before getting them into the ignition. My headlights swept across the snow as I reversed. For a split second, the beam caught something at the edge of the trees. A shape, tall, still, almost human, white moss dripping from its shoulders like wet branches. I blinked, and it was gone. My heartbeat thundered as I drove back down the ridge, tires spinning slightly on icy turns. But as the miles rolled under me, a deeper realization crept into my mind like a slow, invasive root. It wasn't chasing me. It was hurting me, guiding me away from somewhere or toward something else. And for the first time since all this began, a thought struck me harder than fear. The creature wasn't the only presence in these woods. It might not even be the most dangerous one. I didn't drive straight home. I couldn't. My thoughts were too tangled, too loud, like a frantic knocking from the inside of my skull. Something was wrong, not just with the creature, not just with the forest, but with the pattern forming beneath all the strange encounters. Footprints at my cabin, footprints at Tully's. Moss arranged in spirals, knocking beneath the floorboards, the presence in the cave warning me away, the presence beneath the cabin calling me closer. One entity doesn't send mixed messages. Something else was here. By the time I reached the main road, daylight had collapsed behind the ridge, and twilight spread across the sky in a bruised shade of violet. I parked at the ranger station and sat in silence for several minutes before stepping inside. The lights hummed, the old radio crackled softly. Everything looked the same as any other night, but I felt out of place in my own workplace, like I was walking through a memory instead of a room. Avery was there, sorting through incident reports. She looked up with the same concern she'd had around me for weeks now, ever since the first strange story reached our desk. "You look like you saw a ghost," she said. I didn't answer. Not because I didn't want to, but because the truth felt too absurd to speak aloud. I sat across from her, trying to hold on to rationality like a lifeline. "What happened?" she asked. "Elias, you're white as frost." I opened my mouth, and for a second nothing came out. Then I told her the sanitized version. Knocking in the old watch cabin, fresh footprints, signs someone or something was living beneath the floor. I left out the warmth of the moss, the presence in my head, the feeling of being guided. I didn't want to sound delusional, but even stripped of the supernatural edges, the story rattled her. She exhaled, rubbing the bridge of her nose. "Great, another one." "Another one?" I asked. She slid a report across the desk. The paper was creased from anxious hands. A couple staying at a rental cabin near the East Range claimed something knocked on their door at 3 a.m. Slow, rhythmic. When they looked through the peephole, all they saw was white, like something had leaned its body against the door and covered the glass. Below that, another line, footprints outside their window, long enough to be the stride of a man twice average height. Then another report from a hiker who found moss arranged in a spiral on the trail 2 miles from the caves. Then another from a hunter who heard someone whisper his name while he was gutting a deer, only he was alone. Different witnesses, same patterns. Avery looked at me. "We're not dealing with one creature. We're dealing with a behavioral pattern." I shook my head. "No, it's not just behavior. It's communication." She hesitated. "Communication with what?" Before I could answer, the radio on the desk crackled, static at first, then a clipped voice breaking through the noise. "Station, come in. This is Unit 3. Need eyes on this. Elias, Avery, are you there?" It was Ranger Patel, calm, steady Patel, who'd worked these woods even longer than I had. Avery grabbed the receiver. "We're here. What's going on?" Patel's breath came through ragged, like he'd been running. "You need to get to the spillway overlook now." The spillway, a narrow cliffside viewpoint surrounded by dense forest, the place where a man had gone missing 7 years ago, a disappearance that had never been explained. Avery and I exchanged a look. No words needed. We grabbed our gear and headed out. The drive took 15 minutes, but the dread made it feel like an hour. The pines grew darker as we climbed the hill, their shapes merging into tall silhouettes that seemed to lean inward toward the road. The temperature dropped fast, faster than it ever should have on a clear night. Frost crept along the inside corners of the windshield, even with the heater blasting. When we reached the spillway parking lot, Patel's truck was already there. His door hung open, his flashlight lay in the snow, beam still flickering weakly. "Patel?" I called out, the word dissolving into the dark. No answer. We followed the beam of the fallen flashlight toward the overlook. The snow here was thinner, swept away by wind. But the tracks, God, the tracks. Footprints again. But this time there were two kinds, the familiar long, splayed tracks of the tall, moss-covered creature, and beside them, human prints, Patel's. His footprints walked side by side with the creature's for several steps. Then they stopped abruptly, vanishing into a patch of disturbed snow near the cliff's edge. No sign of struggle, no blood, no dragged marks, just an end, like he'd stepped off the earth into nothing. Avery covered her mouth, horror widening her eyes. No. I crouched at the prints, my breath clouding the air. Something was off. I looked again at the tracks, both sets. The creature's impressions weren't randomized. They followed a pattern, a cadence, as if walking in a ritual path, and around the disturbed snow, faint lines, scratches drawn into the crust, a shape, a spiral, fresh, purposeful, and not meant for us. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying a scent so warm and sweet it burned the back of my throat. Avery stiffened. We both turned toward the tree line at the same time. The shape emerged slowly, like it had been waiting for us to notice. Tall, lithe, moss dripping from its limbs in strands that glowed faintly under the moon. Its movements were impossibly fluid, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. It stopped just beyond the reach of our flashlights. Avery whispered, barely audible, "What is that?" I didn't answer. Because something else became clear, something that had lingered in the shadows of my mind for weeks. This creature was not acting alone. Something controlled it, something older, something deeper. And then the realization snapped into focus like a cold blade against my spine. The spirals weren't warnings or markings. They were cages, containment, barriers meant to hold something in. And the creature wasn't the predator. It was the warden. Avery stepped back slowly, her voice trembling. "Elias, where's Patel?" I swallowed, unable to tear my eyes from the creature. Then I heard it, not from the creature, from below the cliff. A voice, faint, distorted, but unmistakably human. A scream, then another, then a long, low exhale that vibrated through the ground beneath our feet, shaking loose snow from branches overhead. Avery grabbed my arm. "We have to go. Elias, we have to go now." The creature took a step forward, not threatening, not hunting, guiding. It tilted its head in a slow, deliberate arc, as though pointing us away from the overlook. Another vibration rolled through the earth, stronger this time. The cliff's edge trembled. A crack split the snow at our feet. The forest held its breath. And then, beneath the icy wind, I heard a sound that froze my blood. Knocking. Slow. Rhythmic. From deep below the cliff. The same knocking that had come from beneath the cabin floor. The same knocking from the caves. The same knocking that had followed me since the beginning. Avery whispered, "That's not the creature, Elias. That's something else." The knocking grew louder. Closer. Coming up. The creature took another step toward us, breaking the ice under its foot. Then another. Its movements were urgent now. Frantic. It wasn't trying to scare us. It was trying to move us. To push us away from what was rising. I grabbed Avery's arm. "Run." And as we turned and sprinted through the snow, the knocking erupted into a roar that splintered the night, shaking the forest from root to canopy. Something was coming out of the ground. Something the creature had been trying to contain. Something older than the pines, something that whispered names through soil and snow. And as we ran, breath burning in our lungs, I realized one truth that hollowed me out from the inside. The creature had never been following me. It had been warning me. We tore through the trees with the kind of speed that doesn't come from strength. It comes from terror. The forest around us blurred into a smear of trunks and shadows, the cold air slicing at our lungs. Behind us, the ground shuddered in violent pulses, each tremor rolling beneath our boots like the heartbeat of something enormous waking beneath the earth. Avery stumbled once but caught herself on a sapling. I pulled her forward, the two of us sprinting up the slope, snow spraying behind us. The glow of my truck's headlights flickered weakly through the trees like a dying signal we were desperate to reach. And then, mid-stride, everything stopped. The trembling ceased. The knocking went silent. Even the wind seemed to fold in on itself. I turned, chest heaving, expecting to see the creature behind us, but it wasn't there. The tree line stood empty, still as a photograph. Avery leaned against a trunk, gasping. Where did it go? I didn't answer, because something inside me, the instinct I'd spent my entire life listening to, knew the creature hadn't vanished. It had gone underground, back to whatever it was trying to hold in place. We reached the truck. Avery slid into the passenger seat while I practically threw myself behind the wheel. The engine coughed once, then roared to life. I reversed fast enough for snow to erupt behind us, spun the wheel, and tore down the hill. But no matter how far the headlights stretched, the forest didn't look like the same forest I'd known all my life. The pines leaned inward, not from wind or weight, but like they were listening, watching, waiting for something that was shifting beneath their roots. Avery stared out the window, her breath fogging the glass. "Elias, if that thing wasn't trying to kill us, then what was it doing?" I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went numb, trying to contain something or keep us away from it. "And Patel," she whispered. I didn't answer. Couldn't. There was no answer that didn't unravel the world we once understood. By the time we reached the ranger station, my pulse had steadied just enough for thought to slip back in around the fear. Avery sat hunched forward, elbows on knees, hands covering her face. I placed a hand on her shoulder. She didn't flinch, but she didn't look up either. "We need to report this," she said. "All of it. Not the sanitized version. The truth." I nodded, though part of me knew the truth wouldn't fit into any incident form. The truth bent around logic. It coiled between the roots of the forest and whispered through old cave systems. It didn't care who believed in it. Inside the station, the fluorescent lights buzzed with a strange static, something I'd never noticed before. Maybe I was imagining it, maybe not. Everything felt heightened now. I went to the far desk, pulled out the map we used for land surveys, and spread it flat. Avery stood beside me. Together, we traced the locations. My cabin, Tully's cabin, the hiker sightings, the strange spirals, the cave, the old Firewatch cabin, the spillway overlook. When the pattern emerged, it wasn't a shape, it was a path, a circular one, a boundary, a containment ring. Avery's voice trembled. "So everything inside the circle, that's where it is?" "No," I said, throat tightening. "That's where it's trapped. And the creature, it's the one maintaining the boundary." Silence stretched between us, a silence filled with a terrible realization. Patel hadn't been taken by the creature. He'd been taken by what the creature was trying to hold back. Avery's eyes shone under the harsh lights. "We can't fix this, Elias." "No," I said quietly, "but we can witness it, and we can warn others." She swallowed hard. Warn them of what? The answer formed slowly, curling up from the deepest part of my mind, that the forest's greatest danger isn't what we can see. It's what the forest itself fears. A sound broke the silence, a deep, distant knock, soft but unmistakable, echoed through the station walls. We froze. Another knock, closer this time. I reached for the radio, but static swallowed the frequency instantly, the device crackling with a low melodic hum. Avery backed toward the weapons locker. It found us. "No," I whispered, because through the static, a different sensation pressed into my thoughts. A familiar pressure, gentle and heavy at the same time. Not hostile. Warning, the same presence from the cave, the same warmth in the moss, the warden. I stepped toward the station's main door, feeling Avery's terrified gaze on my back. The knock came again from outside. Slow, rhythmic, deliberate, not demanding entry, not threatening, calling me. I opened the door. The freezing air rushed in, biting at my skin. The forest beyond the threshold was drenched in moonlight, the snow aglow with a soft blue sheen. And just beyond the edge of light, it stood, tall, motionless. Moss hanging from its limbs in long, swaying strands carried by a wind I couldn't feel. Its dark, hollow eyes fixed on me, not predatory, but filled with something like urgency. Avery whispered behind me, "Elias, don't go out there." But I stepped across the threshold. The creature didn't move toward me. It stepped aside, as though showing me something, as though revealing what it needed me to see. The ground beyond it shuddered lightly. A faint rumble rolled beneath the snow, then faded. The creature lifted its head slightly. Another presence stirred deeper in the forest, far larger, far heavier, knocking, slow, deep, growing louder. A warning pushed through the center of my mind, clearer than ever. Do not let it surface. My breath caught. How? The creature's head turned toward the pines, toward the distant rumbling beneath the earth. Then, for the first time, I realized something else. It wasn't just trying to contain whatever lived below. It was failing. The knocks grew louder, like a massive hand striking the underside of the world. The snow trembled in a fine dust. The pines groaned under their own weight as vibrations rippled through their roots. Avery ran to my side. "Elias, the ground." I know. The forest held its breath. The knocking stopped. Then something began to push upward from beneath the far ridge. The snow rising slowly and bulging like something enormous was pressing against it from below. Not a creature, something shapeless, shifting, ancient. Something that had slept beneath the forest long before humans ever stepped foot here. The creature beside me, the warden, did something I had never imagined it could do. It stepped in front of me, protecting me. Not from the forest, from what was waking beneath it. Moonlight flickered against its moss-covered form as it lifted one long arm, placing its hand on the ground. A pulse spread through the earth, a wave of heat melting the top layer of snow. The bulge in the ridge trembled, then receded like something withdrawing beneath the surface. The knocking slowed, softened, faded. The forest exhaled. The creature, breathing heavily now, moss trembling, turned toward me. A final thought pressed into my mind. Weary, old, resigned, not forever. Avery tugged my sleeve gently. Elias, let's go inside. But I couldn't move. Not yet. The warden's form flickered in the moonlight, fading at the edges like it was dissolving back into the forest. Its limbs bent inward, its head lowered, the moss draped over its shoulders fell still, then it stepped backward into shadow and disappeared between the pines, leaving nothing but silence behind. A silence filled with a truth that settled deep into my bones. Some spirits guard the forest, some haunt it, and some hold back the darkness beneath it. The thread line isn't just old, it's alive, and it remembers. Avery placed a hand on my back, grounding me. Elias, what do we do now? I stared into the forest, the place that raised me, tested me, terrified me, and somehow trusted me enough to show me the truth buried beneath its roots. We tell the stories, I said quietly, the way they were meant to be told. Why? So people listen, so they respect the boundaries, so they pass the warnings on. I turned toward her, the cold settling into my lungs like ice and purpose at the same time, because someday that thing beneath the forest will rise again. And when it does, my breath escaped in a long, frosted cloud. The spirits of the pines won't be able to stop it alone.